My husband told me to spend our 12th wedding anniversary alone because something came up at exactly 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday, and by 9:12 that same night I was sitting in the parking lot of the Wickham Grand Hotel watching him carry a bottle of Dom Perignon 2008, the one I bought him for his 40th birthday, into room 412, where a 29-year-old event planner named Bianca Reyes was waiting in a silk robe that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. If you're watching this from a car right now, sitting outside somewhere you never thought you'd be parked, staring at a building you're not supposed to be staring at, comment the city you're in below, because I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to want to remember exactly where you were sitting when you heard this story. Like this video and subscribe before you go any further, because what I did the next morning didn't just end a marriage, it ended a family's entire financial empire, and I want you here for every second of it. My name is Elena Cross. I kept my maiden name when I married Marcus Whitfield 11 years ago, not out of some feminist statement, but because I built my professional reputation as a forensic accountant before I ever put on that ring. And reputations like mine take 15 years to build and about 15 minutes to destroy if the wrong person gets nervous about what you might find in their books. I specialize in tracing money that doesn't want to be traced: embezzlement, shell companies, laundering routed through real estate holding groups that look legitimate on the surface and rot underneath like a house with termites eating the studs behind drywall that still looks freshly painted. I tell you this now because it matters later. Everything matters later in this story. Nothing I'm about to tell you is a coincidence. There were 3 things I didn't know on that Thursday night in the parking lot of the Wickham Grand. I didn't know that my husband and his business partner, a man named Trevor Locke, had been quietly draining $840,000 out of the Whitfield Development Group's escrow accounts over the previous 19 months, routing it through a shell entity called Meridian Capital Holdings that existed only as a P.O. box in Wilmington, Delaware. I didn't know that Bianca Reyes wasn't a stranger my husband had met at some conference, but a woman his own sister, Caroline Whitfield Hayes, had personally introduced him to at a charity gala 18 months earlier, and had been covering for the two of them ever since with the kind of casual, practiced lies that only family members know how to tell without flinching. And I didn't know that in exactly 11 weeks, on a Saturday evening in a ballroom filled with 320 guests, all of it, every dollar, every text message, every lie, was going to come apart in front of the entire Whitfield family's social and business circle, live, with federal agents standing at the exits. But that Thursday night, sitting in my Audi with the engine off and my hands shaking just slightly on the steering wheel, all I knew was the number on the digital clock on my dashboard, 9:12 p.m., and the sound of my own heartbeat, and the fact that my husband, the man who had built his entire public identity on being the golden son of Whitfield Development, a real estate dynasty his father, Harold Whitfield Sr., had spent 41 years constructing, was upstairs in a hotel room with a woman I'd never met, on the one night of the year that was supposed to belong to me. I want to take you back further than that Thursday, because to understand how cold and how exact my response was, you need to understand exactly what kind of family I married into, and exactly what kind of woman they underestimated when they let me sit at their table for 11 years. Marcus Whitfield was 39 years old the year I married him, and he had never, not for a single day of his adult life, earned a dollar that didn't originate from his father's company. He carried himself like old money, tailored Brioni suits, a 2019 Porsche 911 he leased and released every 2 years so it always looked new, a corner office on the 14th floor of the Whitfield Tower downtown, with his name in brushed steel letters on the door. But underneath that surface, Marcus Whitfield was drowning in debt so deep it would have been almost impressive if it weren't so recklessly, deliberately hidden from me for over a decade. I know now, because I went back and traced every transaction myself once I started looking, that by the time we married, Marcus already owed $193,000 in personal credit lines, all of it disguised behind a series of business expense categories his father's accountant, a tired, compliant man named Gerald Fitch who'd worked for the family for 26 years and had long since stopped asking hard questions, simply signed off on without a second glance. His mother, Diane Whitfield, had a single defining trait that I watched her perform at every single family gathering for 11 straight years. Arrogance so total it functioned like a force field. Diane did not walk into rooms, she arrived in them, the way weather arrives, and she expected the room to rearrange itself around her presence before she'd even removed her coat. At our wedding rehearsal dinner, she stood up during the toasts, looked directly at me in front of 40 guests, and said, "Well, Elena isn't what I pictured for Marcus, but I suppose someone in this family needs to know how to balance a checkbook. Everyone laughed. I smiled, because I had already learned, 3 years into dating her son, that smiling through Diane's insults was simply the entry fee for staying in the family, and I had decided the entry fee was worth paying. For a while, anyway. Marcus's sister Caroline was 2 years younger than him, married to a hedge fund analyst named Preston Hayes who worked 11-hour days while Caroline spent them at Pilates studios and lunch clubs. And her defining trait, the one she repeated so consistently it became almost a kind of tell, was entitlement. A bone-deep conviction that the Whitfield name itself was a form of currency that should never need to be backed up by actual effort or actual money. Caroline once told me, over brunch, without a hint of irony, that she'd never worked a single day of paid employment in her life, and saw no reason to start now, as if this were a virtue rather than an admission. She was the one who introduced Marcus to Bianca Reyes. She was the one who, for 18 months, hosted girls' trips to Napa and Cabo that were really cover stories for Marcus and Bianca's weekends together, and she never once, in all that time, looked me in the eye and told me the truth, even when I asked her directly, twice, if something felt off with Marcus. And then there was Trevor Locke, Marcus's college roommate turned business partner turned, eventually co-conspirator in the single largest embezzlement scheme in Whitfield Development's history. Trevor's defining trait was pure, uncomplicated opportunism. He didn't hate me, didn't particularly love Marcus either. He simply calculated, correctly, that being close to a family with 41 years of real estate holdings and a compliant accountant was the fastest route to a life he could never have built on his own merit. Trevor had been quietly siphoning funds from 3 separate Whitfield development projects since before Marcus even got involved, and when Marcus's gambling debts, yes, gambling, a habit he'd hidden from everyone including, for years, even me, became too large to ignore, Trevor simply widened the pipeline and pulled Marcus in as a partner in the theft, rather than risk Marcus discovering it and exposing him. I tell you all 4 of these people's defining traits up front. Clearly, because you're going to watch each one of them perform that exact same trait, over and over, for the rest of this story, right up until the night it finally cost them everything. Arrogance, entitlement, opportunism, and Bianca Reyes, whose trait was simpler and uglier than the rest. Pure, calculated opportunism dressed up as romance, a 29-year-old event planner who saw a 51-year-old family fortune wrapped around a weak, indebted 40-year-old man and decided that was a business opportunity worth pursuing patiently. The one person in that family who never underestimated me, who I think actually respected me more than he respected his own son, was Harold Whitfield Sr. himself. Harold was 73 years old, a man who'd built a $210 million development company from a single strip mall parking lot he'd financed with a second mortgage on his childhood home in 1985. And he had a lawyer, his lawyer, the family's lawyer, the man who'd drafted every trust document, every succession plan, every ironclad clause protecting Whitfield Development from exactly the kind of internal theft his own son was committing, named Robert Voss. Robert had been with Harold for 31 years. Robert did not like Marcus. Robert had never liked Marcus, ever since Marcus was 26 years old and Robert caught him trying to forge his father's signature on a distribution request that would have pulled $200,000 out of the family trust to cover a debt at an underground poker game in Atlantic City. Harold never found out about that one. Robert quietly killed the request and never told Marcus he knew. But Robert remembered. Robert always remembered. I met Robert Voss for the first time at my own wedding, where he shook my hand, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time, something between curiosity and appraisal, and said, "You're the accountant." Good. This family could use one who actually reads the fine print. I laughed it off as an old man's dry joke. It would be 9 years before I understood he meant it as a warning, and an invitation, both at once. That Thursday night in the parking lot of the Wickham Grand, I didn't call Robert Voss. Not yet. I sat there until 11:40 p.m., watching the light in room 412 go dark, watching my husband's shadow cross the curtain once, twice, and then not again. I drove home. I did not cry. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters for everything that comes after. I did not cry once. Not that night, not for the next 11 weeks, not even at the very end when everything finally broke open in front of 320 witnesses. I have spent my entire career reading numbers that lie, statements that are dressed up to look clean when the truth underneath is rot, and somewhere in that parking lot, watching my husband's silhouette move behind a hotel curtain, Some part of my brain simply switched from wife into forensic accountant, and it never switched back. I went home, I made a cup of chamomile tea I never drank, and at 11:58 p.m. I opened my personal laptop, not the one connected to Whitfield Development servers, a separate one, clean, untraceable, the one I used for my own independent consulting work, and I typed a single sentence into a blank document. Marcus Whitfield, Financial Timeline, beginning 2019. I didn't know yet what I would find. I only knew, with the same cold certainty I feel when I open a set of books that have been quietly cooked for years, that something underneath my marriage had been rotting for a very long time, and that the affair I just witnessed was very likely not the only thing my husband had been hiding from me. I was right. I had no idea, that night, just how right I was. I want to walk you through the next 11 weeks in order, because the order matters. Nothing about what I did was impulsive. Everything was sequenced, deliberate, built layer on layer the way you build a forensic case that has to survive not just a spouse's denial but a defense attorney's cross-examination. Because somewhere around week 3, I stopped thinking of this as a marriage falling apart and started thinking of it as an audit. My audit. My case file. And I intended to close it clean. The morning after the Wickham Grand, I woke up next to Marcus at 6:15 a.m., the way I had for 11 years. And I watched him roll over, check his phone under the covers, a habit he thought I'd never noticed, though I had noticed it for at least 4 months by then, and mutter something about a closing dinner with investors that had run late. I said nothing. I made him coffee, the same way I always did, 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, and I kissed him on the cheek before he left for the office at 7:40. And the entire time, some cold, quiet part of my mind was already running numbers. Investors. What investors? I managed enough of Whitfield Development's peripheral consulting work over the years. Harold occasionally brought me in on smaller compliance reviews, never anything core, but enough that I understood the shape of their deal calendar, to know there was no active closing that week. None. I checked the moment his car left the driveway. That first weekend, I did something I am not proud of and would do again in a heartbeat. I went through Marcus's home office while he was at his Saturday golf game with Trevor Locke. I found nothing on the surface. His desk was, as always, immaculate, the kind of curated tidiness that exists specifically to signal nothing is being hidden. But I've spent 15 years learning that the cleanest-looking books are usually hiding the dirtiest numbers, and Marcus's desk drawer, the bottom one, locked with a small brass key he kept on his own keyring rather than the shared bowl by the door, told me everything the surface wouldn't. I didn't have the key that day. I made a mental note of the lock's brand, a Master Lock 175D, and ordered a bump key online that same night, shipped to a P.O. box I opened at a UPS store 14 minutes from our house, under my maiden name, using a business address tied to an LLC I quietly formed that same week, called Ashcroft Analytics, a shell of my own, built for exactly one purpose, giving myself a professional, untraceable foothold to investigate my own husband without leaving fingerprints connected to our shared home network or shared finances. By week 2, I had the bump key. I had also, more importantly, gone back through 11 years of joint bank statements, something I had never once done in detail because I trusted him, God. I trusted him completely, the way you trust the ground under your feet until the day it gives way. What I found in those statements, once I actually sat down and traced every transfer with the same rigor I'd apply to a client's fraud case, was a pattern of withdrawals from our joint HELOC, a home equity line of credit against our house on Birchwood Lane, a house worth $1.4 million, totaling $161,000 over the previous 14 months, all categorized under a memo line that simply read, Business WDG Consulting, money that had never once been discussed with me, never once appeared on any Whitfield Development ledger I'd ever had access to, and never once made its way back into any account I could trace. I remember sitting at my kitchen island at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks in, with a legal pad covered in numbers, the blue light of my laptop the only thing on in the house, and feeling something shift permanently inside my chest. It wasn't grief. Grief would come later, in small, manageable doses, mostly late at night, mostly private, mostly something I refused to let anyone, not even my own mother, witness. What I felt that Tuesday night was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a puzzle you've been circling for years suddenly resolves into a single, coherent, horrifying shape. My husband was not just cheating on me. My husband was bleeding money out of our shared life at a rate that, if it continued unchecked, would have left me not just heartbroken but genuinely, catastrophically broke. Because our house, our retirement accounts, and yes, even a portion of my own consulting firm's operating capital, all sat inside financial structures Marcus had quiet signing authority over, structures I had trusted him with because that trust, at the time, felt like love rather than exposure. I opened Marcus's locked drawer on a Sunday afternoon, week 4, while he was at what he called a site visit that lasted 6 hours, and, according to the license plate reader data from a private investigator I hadn't yet hired, I'll get to that, never once took him near an actual Whitfield development property. Inside the drawer, I found 3 things that changed the entire shape of what I was investigating. The first was a folded printout of a wire transfer confirmation, dated 11 months earlier, for $210,000, sent from an account labeled WDG Escrow Meridian Project to an entity called Meridian Capital Holdings LLC. The second was a burner phone, a cheap prepaid Android I'd never seen before, its battery dead, its existence alone answering questions I hadn't even known to ask yet. The third was a small blue velvet box from a jeweler I recognized immediately, Halloran & Wick, the same jeweler where Marcus had bought my own wedding ring 11 years earlier, containing a pair of diamond earrings with a receipt tucked beneath the velvet lining. $18,400, purchased 6 days after our anniversary, 6 days after the Wickham Grand. I photographed everything. I did not remove anything. I put it all back exactly as I'd found it, down to the angle of the velvet box lid, because I understood, even in that moment of raw fury sitting alone in my own home office holding evidence of my husband's double life, that the difference between a woman who gets outmaneuvered in a divorce and a woman who wins one is patience. Evidence that's been visibly tampered with is worthless. Evidence that's been documented, dated, and left undisturbed is a weapon. That night, I made my first real move. I called a private investigator named Marisol Ferrer, a former financial crimes detective with the Metro Police Department, who now ran her own agency specializing in exactly the kind of corporate-adjacent infidelity and asset-tracing cases that straddled the line between a divorce matter and an actual fraud investigation. Marisol had a reputation. I'd used her once, years earlier, for a client's due diligence case, for being absolutely ruthless about documentation and absolutely silent about everything else. I told her I wanted 2 things: a full financial trace on Meridian Capital Holdings LLC and photographic surveillance on my husband for the next 6 weeks. No exceptions, no days off. She quoted me $11,000 for the initial phase. I paid her from a separate account I'd opened under Ashcroft Analytics, funded from my own consulting income, money Marcus didn't know existed and couldn't touch. Within 4 days, Marisol had traced Meridian Capital Holdings to a registered agent in Wilmington, Delaware. A P.O. box service, no actual office, no employees, nothing but a filing address. The kind of shell that exists purely to receive and redirect money without leaving an obvious trail. The listed manager on Meridian's incorporation documents was a name I didn't recognize at first. T. Locke Holdings, a secondary entity registered 8 months before Meridian itself, which traced back, after 2 more layers of digging, directly to Trevor Locke's personal social security number, buried in a state business filing that most people would never think to cross-reference against a corporate structure 3 degrees removed. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I told anyone, even Marisol, what I intended to do with it, because I needed to understand the full shape of the scheme before I moved, and understanding the full shape meant going back even further than the HELOC withdrawals. Back into the actual books of Whitfield Development Group itself. Books I technically had partial, legitimate access to from the compliance work Harold had brought me in on over the years. Access that had never been revoked because, frankly, no one in that family had ever imagined I would use it against them. Over the following 10 days, working late at night after Marcus was asleep, sometimes not sleeping at all, I built what I would eventually hand over as a 53-page forensic report, though at that point it was still raw. Spreadsheets, transaction logs, wire confirmations, cross-referenced against 3 separate development projects. The Ashgrove Commons Retail Center, the Pemberton Heights Residential Development, and the Meridian Business Park, the largest of the 3, an $84 million project that was supposed to break ground in exactly 11 weeks with a groundbreaking gala that Harold Whitfield Sr. had already booked at the Cathedral Room downtown. 320 guests, investors, city council members, half the family's social circle. The pattern I found was elegant in its cruelty. elegant the way all long-running fraud eventually becomes once you understand the mechanism. Trevor Locke, as the general contractor's liaison on all three projects, had been inflating change order invoices by an average of 11%, funneling the overage through fake subcontractor accounts he controlled, then routing a portion of that inflated overage into Meridian Capital Holdings, which existed, near as I could tell, entirely to launder the money back out as consulting fees that eventually landed, in smaller increments, in accounts Marcus controlled, accounts that fed his gambling debts. His gifts to Bianca Reyes, and I discovered with a specific, sickening kind of clarity around week 6, a second HELOC he'd quietly opened against a rental property we jointly owned, a property I hadn't even remembered we still held title to, netting him another $94,000 I'd never authorized and never known about. Total, across 19 months, once I finished the full trace, $841,600 stolen from Whitfield Development Group's active construction escrows and personal home equity combined, funneled through a shell company controlled jointly by my husband and his college roommate, spent on gambling debts, a mistress, and a lifestyle Marcus had spent our entire marriage pretending was funded by legitimate success rather than theft dressed up in a tailored suit. I remember the exact moment I finished the final reconciliation, week 7, 2:47 a.m., my kitchen island covered in printouts, and I sat back in my chair and I felt, for the first time since the Wickham Grand parking lot, something other than cold clarity. I felt almost, and I want to be honest with you because this story only works if I'm honest, I felt almost grateful. Grateful that I had married a man reckless and stupid enough to leave a trail this wide, this sloppy, this traceable. Because a smarter thief, a more careful one, might have gotten away with it. Marcus wasn't smart. Marcus was entitled. He'd spent his entire life assuming consequences were things that happened to other people, and that assumption, more than any single piece of evidence I found, was the thing that was going to destroy him. That was the week I finally called Robert Voss. I called Robert Voss on a Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, the way I knew he'd appreciate. Robert was a man who distrusted anyone who called after 9, said it meant they hadn't done their homework the night before. I asked to meet him somewhere away from the Whitfield Tower, away from any camera or assistant who might mention to Diane or Caroline that Elena Cross had come by unannounced. He suggested a diner on the edge of downtown, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that never stopped refilling. A place, he told me later, he'd been using for exactly these kinds of conversations for 31 years. I laid the folder on the table between us. Not the full 53 pages, not yet. Just enough. 6 pages, the wire transfer to Meridian Capital Holdings, the T-Lock Holdings Incorporation filing, and a summary table showing the 11% inflation pattern across all 3 projects. Robert put on his reading glasses, and I watched a 73-year-old man who had spent 3 decades protecting the Whitfield family's business from every kind of threat go completely, utterly still. He read the 6 pages twice. Then he looked up at me and said, "How long have you known?" 7 weeks, I said. About the money, about 12 hours, about her. Robert took his glasses off slowly, folded them, set them on the table with a precision that told me he was buying time to think. "Harold trusts his son," he said, blindly. "It's the one blind spot that man has ever had in his entire life. If I bring this to him wrong, he'll find a way to protect Marcus anyway, out of guilt, out of pride, and Trevor Locke will disappear to some country with no extradition treaty before the ink dries on any settlement. You understand that?" "I do," I said. "That's why I'm not asking you to bring it to Harold. Not yet. I'm asking you to help me build it so tight, so complete, so undeniable, that when it does go to Harold, there won't be a version of events where Marcus walks away clean. I want documentation strong enough for a federal wire fraud referral, not a family intervention." Robert looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look I'd only seen him give me once before, at my own wedding, 9 years earlier. "You're the accountant," he said, echoing his own words from that day, almost word for word. "Good. This family could finally use one who actually reads the fine print." Then he reached across the table, and for the first time in 9 years of knowing him, Robert Voss shook my hand like a business partner rather than his employer's daughter-in-law. "I have a contact in the FBI's Financial Crimes Division," he said. "A man named Special Agent Denise Okafor worked with her on a construction fraud case in 2019. If your numbers hold up the way they look like they hold up, she's going to want to see this eventually. But we build it airtight first. No mistakes, no leaks. And Elena, not a word to Marcus, not a flicker, Not for 11 more weeks. You have to live inside this lie perfectly until we're ready to end it. I told him I could do that. I didn't tell him how easy it had already become, how, within 7 weeks, I had learned to kiss my husband goodbye in the morning with the same warmth I always had, to ask about his day at dinner with genuine-sounding curiosity, to sleep beside him at night without a single tremor in my breathing, all while a growing case file against him sat on an encrypted drive under a company he'd never heard of. I had spent my whole career learning to read the small tells of people trying to hide something. It turned out I was even better at being the one hiding it. Over the following weeks, Robert and I built the case in earnest, cross-referencing every invoice from all 3 projects against actual subcontractor labor and materials records, most of which I obtained legitimately through the compliance access Harold had granted me years earlier, the rest through Marisol Ferrer's contacts at the county recorder's office. We found 17 separate change orders on the Meridian Business Park project alone that had no corresponding physical work performed, totaling $311,000 in pure fabrication. Invoices for concrete pours that never happened, electrical rough-ins on floors that hadn't been framed yet, phantom subcontractors with addresses that traced back to residential apartments in 3 different states. While that work continued in the background, life at the Whitfield family's surface level went on exactly as it always had, which meant I continued having the exact kind of interactions with Diane and Caroline that I'd been having for 11 years, except now I was watching them with entirely different eyes. The first real test came at week 5, before Robert and I had even met, at a Sunday family dinner at Harold and Diane's estate in Ridgemont Hills. The kind of dinner the Whitfields hosted every 3rd Sunday without fail, 7 of us around a table that could seat 16. Diane at the head, even though it was technically Harold's house, because Diane had never in her life sat anywhere but the head of a table. She was wearing a pair of sapphire earrings that evening, and within the first 20 minutes of dinner she'd found a way to mention, unprompted, that they were a small gift from Harold, nothing extravagant, though I suppose extravagance means different things to different people, a comment aimed, as her comments always were, at reminding everyone at the table exactly where they stood in relation to her. Diane's arrogance that night, as it had for 11 years, performed itself on schedule, right down to the minute. She asked me, in front of everyone, whether my little consulting business was still keeping busy, the same question she'd asked at nearly every family dinner since I'd started Ashcroft Analytics years earlier, always with the same faint emphasis on little, always delivered with a smile that made the insult deniable, if I'd ever had the poor taste to call it out. I told her, that night, that business was better than ever, actually, and smiled back at her with a warmth I did not feel, because I already knew, sitting there with sapphire earrings glinting under the chandelier, that Diane Whitfield's entire self-image was built on a fortune that was currently being hollowed out from the inside by her own son, and that within a matter of weeks, that fortune, and the arrogance it funded, was going to become a very different kind of story. Caroline's entitlement showed itself twice more over those weeks, each time in a way that, looking back, I find almost darkly funny in its consistency. The first was at that same Sunday dinner, when she mentioned, casually, over dessert, that she and Preston were considering a 3rd home, a ski property in Aspen. Nothing crazy, maybe $4 million, Daddy will probably help with the down payment the way he always does, said with the flat, unblinking entitlement of someone who had genuinely never once in her adult life considered that money might not simply appear because she wanted something. I watched her say this while knowing with absolute certainty that the same family fortune she was casually spending in a hypothetical Aspen ski chalet was currently being drained by her own brother at a rate that would leave far less than $4 million of help available to anyone by the time this was all over. The second time was smaller, quieter, and told me more than any grand gesture could have. I ran into Caroline at a coffee shop near her Pilates studio, week 8, and she mentioned, almost as an aside, stirring oat milk into her latte, that she'd seen Marcus having lunch with a friend the previous week. And when I asked, casually, who the friend was, Caroline's face did something I'd never seen it do before in 9 years of knowing her. A flicker, fast, almost imperceptible. The flicker of someone realizing mid-sentence they've said something they shouldn't have. Oh, just a colleague, she said, too quickly, and changed the subject to her upcoming trip to Cabo. And I understood, in that exact moment, standing in line for a coffee I never finished, that Caroline had known about Bianca Reyes for a very long time, possibly from the beginning, possibly since the charity gala 18 months earlier where she'd first introduced them. And that every single girls' trip invitation she'd extended to me over that period, every "let's do brunch, just us" text, had been, at least in part, cover for her own brother's affair. I didn't confront her. Not then. I finished my coffee, I hugged her goodbye the way I always did, and I drove home and added a new line item to my private notes. Caroline, aware, minimum 18 months, likely facilitator via Bianca introduction, corroborate via Marisol. 2 days later, Marisol confirmed it. Surveillance photos from a charity gala 18 months earlier, pulled from the event's own promotional Instagram account, showed Caroline Whitfield Hayes standing between Marcus and a young woman, later confirmed as Bianca Reyes, all three of them smiling for the camera, Caroline's hand resting lightly on Bianca's shoulder in a gesture of introduction so casual, so practiced, it could only have come from someone entirely comfortable with what she was setting into motion. Trevor Locke's opportunism performed itself just as reliably, though Trevor was smoother about it than Caroline, which made sense given that lying to business partners was, functionally, his entire second career. I saw Trevor twice during those 11 weeks in settings where I could watch him closely. Once at the same Sunday dinner, week 5, where he'd been invited as practically family, after 15 years of friendship with Marcus, and once at a Whitfield Development Quarterly Mixer, week 9, an event I attended specifically because Robert Voss and I had agreed I needed eyes and ears inside the building in the weeks leading up to the gala. At the Sunday dinner, Trevor spent 40 minutes charming Harold Whitfield Sr. with a detailed, entirely fabricated update on the Meridian Business Park's construction timeline, describing subcontractor progress on electrical and plumbing rough-ins with the kind of specific, confident detail that only a genuinely skilled liar can produce. Dates, crew sizes, material delivery schedules, all of it plausible, all of it I now knew from my own forensic trace, almost entirely fictional. Harold nodded along, proud, occasionally glancing at Diane with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed his life's work was in capable hands. I sat 2 seats down, cutting into a piece of herb-crusted chicken I don't remember tasting, watching a man describe, in granular detail, a construction site that existed mostly on paper and in the invoices he'd fabricated to steal from it. At the Quarterly Mixer week 9, I watched Trevor work the room the way he always did, moving between investors and city officials with a drink he never seemed to actually finish, dropping compliments calibrated precisely to what each person wanted to hear. And I understood, watching him, that opportunism wasn't really a flaw in Trevor's character so much as the entire architecture of it. Trevor didn't dislike me. Trevor didn't dislike anyone, really, in the sense that disliking someone would require caring about them enough to have a feeling about them at all. Trevor evaluated people the way I evaluated a set of books, for what they could yield, and nothing else. That night, he found me by the bar and made a comment, half joking, that I've turned over in my mind many times since. "Elena, you're the only person in this whole family who actually understands money. Frankly wasted, married into a family that's this bad at spending it." He laughed. I laughed too and told him he had no idea how right he was, and he had no idea, standing there with his drink he never finished, just how literally true that sentence was about to become. Bianca Reyes. I only saw in person once during those 11 weeks, and I engineered the encounter myself, deliberately, at week 10, 1 week before the gala. I found out, through Marisol's surveillance, that Bianca was coordinating event logistics for a separate corporate function at the Cathedral Room, the same venue booked for the Whitfield Gala the following week, giving her legitimate professional reason to be on-site doing a walkthrough. I arranged, through a business contact of my own, to be at the Cathedral Room that same afternoon under the pretense of reviewing catering contracts for an unrelated Ashcroft Analytics client event, and I made sure our paths crossed in the lobby. She recognized me immediately. I could see it in the half-second flicker across her face, the flicker of someone calculating, fast, whether to flee or brazen it out, and she chose to brazen it out, extending her hand with a composure that I'll admit, professionally, I respected even as I despised the woman behind it. "Elena Cross," she said, "I've heard so much about you." I shook her hand, held her gaze a beat longer than comfortable, and said, "Funny, I've heard almost nothing about you, until recently." Her smile didn't waver, but her hand, I noticed, was very slightly damp. "I hope I get to see you at the gala next week," she said, with a precision I recognized instantly, the precision of a woman who already knew she'd be there, who had already been promised, by Marcus, some version of a future in which she'd be standing beside him at that exact event, dressed the way his wife should have been dressed, on the arm of a man whose money that wasn't even his, money stolen from his own father's company, had bought her those earrings, that robe, that confidence. "I'll be there," I told her, and smiled and walked away and did not look back. Because I already knew, with the same cold certainty I'd felt since the parking lot of the Wickham Grand, that the next time Bianca Reyes saw me in a room, it would be the last time she ever felt that particular kind of confidence again. By the time I got home that evening, I had reached what Robert and I had started calling, half grimly, the 40% mark, the point in our case building where the financial fraud trail was airtight enough to survive federal scrutiny, but where we still hadn't decided exactly how, and exactly when, to force the personal betrayal into the open alongside it. I sat down that night and wrote out, by hand, on the same legal pad I'd started 7 weeks earlier, a single sentence that has stayed with me since. "You do not get to keep both the money and the lie. You only ever got to keep one, and you're about to lose both." If you've made it this far into this story, I want you to do something for me before we keep going, because what happens in the next part of this video is the part that actually broke this family open, and I don't want you missing a second of it. Hit subscribe now, and if you've ever sat across a dinner table from someone who was smiling at you while lying to your face, a parent, a partner, a friend who already knew the truth and let you keep believing the lie, comment the word table below, because I promise you, by the time this story ends, you're going to understand exactly why that detail matters more than almost anything else in this entire case. Because the truth is, everything I'd built up to that point, the wire transfers, the shell company, the surveillance photos of Caroline's hand on Bianca's shoulder, all of it was still just documentation, paper, numbers on a page. What came next is where the story stopped being an audit and started being something closer to a reckoning. Because at week 11, 6 days before the Meridian Business Park groundbreaking gala, I discovered something that changed the entire shape of my plan, something that told me Marcus's betrayal ran even deeper and even closer to home than I had allowed myself to imagine. The discovery came from Marisol on a Wednesday afternoon, 6 days before the gala, delivered not over the phone the way our updates usually came, but in person at her office, because she told me, flatly, that this particular finding needed to be said to my face. Marisol had spent the previous 2 weeks doing something I hadn't specifically asked for but had authorized in the broadest possible terms. A full background trace on Bianca Reyes, financial history, prior relationships, prior employers, the kind of deep dive due diligence I would normally run on a hostile business counterparty rather than my own husband's mistress. What she found rewrote everything I thought I understood about the 18 months I'd been quietly investigating. Bianca Reyes was not simply an event planner who had been introduced to Marcus at a gala and fallen into an affair with a wealthy, weak-willed man looking for an escape from his own decaying marriage. Bianca Reyes had, 4 years earlier, been engaged, briefly, for 11 months, to a man named Grant Aldis, the son of a competing development firm, Aldis & Kerr, a company that had lost the bid on the Meridian Business Park site to Whitfield Development in a contentious, closely watched city rezoning vote 2 years prior. The engagement to Grant Aldis had ended badly, publicly, with accusations on both sides that had made minor local business gossip pages at the time. Accusations, Marisol's research suggested, that Bianca had been quietly, systematically extracting confidential bid information from Grant during their relationship and feeding it to a still unidentified third party. I sat in Marisol's office, a manila folder heavier than any of the others open on the desk between us, and felt the floor of my own investigation shift beneath me. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that Bianca Reyes has a documented history of using relationships to extract confidential business information from development companies competing for the same contracts Whitfield has been bidding on." "I'm telling you," Marisol said, "that 4 weeks after Bianca Reyes began seeing your husband, Whitfield Development's chief competitor for 2 subsequent mid-sized projects mysteriously undercut every single one of Whitfield's bids by a margin too precise to be coincidence. I'm telling you Bianca Reyes has an email account, under a variation of her maiden name, Bianca Reyes Kowalski, that I traced to a domain registered to a shell entity with an address 1 block from Aldis & Kerr's headquarters. And I'm telling you that on 4 separate occasions over the past 14 months, that email account received attachments. I don't have the contents, they're encrypted, but I have the metadata, sender, recipient, file size, timestamp, from an internal Whitfield Development email address belonging to your husband." The room went very quiet. I remember the specific, absurd detail of a ceiling fan clicking softly overhead, slightly unbalanced, ticking against its own housing with every rotation, and I remember thinking, with a kind of detached, almost clinical horror, that my husband hadn't simply cheated on me with a woman who wanted his money. He had, very possibly, without even realizing it, because Marcus, for all his faults, was never quite smart enough to realize when he was the one being used, handed his own father's confidential bid strategy, project margins, and construction cost breakdowns to a woman who was funneling them straight to Whitfield Development's biggest competitor, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with a 4-year-old grudge against the company that had beaten her ex-fiancé's family firm out of an $84 million contract. This was Loop B closing, and it closed not with the simple, almost mundane cruelty of infidelity I had braced myself for over 11 weeks, but with something far larger, the realization that the affair I had discovered in a hotel parking lot on my anniversary was never really about romance at all. It was corporate espionage wearing the costume of a love affair, and my husband, arrogant and financially desperate and utterly unaware of how thoroughly he was being played, had been both a victim and a perpetrator at the exact same time, betraying his own father's company on 2 separate fronts simultaneously, without ever understanding the second betrayal was happening at all. I asked Marisol the question I already knew the answer to before I finished asking it. Does Caroline know any of this? About who Bianca actually is? Marisol slid a final photograph across the desk, a grainy but clear shot, time-stamped 11 months earlier, of Caroline Whitfield Hayes and Bianca Reyes having what was unmistakably not their first meeting, seated across from each other at a restaurant 20 minutes outside the city, in a booth positioned specifically away from the windows, the kind of seating choice people make when they don't want to be seen together. Caroline introduced them at that gala 18 months ago, Marisol said, but this photo is from 11 months ago, 7 months after the introduction. They were still meeting privately, long after Marcus and Bianca were established. I can't tell you what they discussed. But I can tell you your sister-in-law has been in regular, deliberate contact with the woman who may have helped leak your family's confidential bid data to a competitor for at least 11 months and never once mentioned it to anyone in the family. I want to be honest with you about what happened to me in the following 48 hours, because it's the closest I came in this entire 11-week process to losing the cold, controlled discipline I had built up since that first night in the parking lot. I did not cry. I told you already, I never cried through any of this, and I meant it. But I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do in 7 weeks. I sat alone in my car, in my own garage, engine off, for nearly 2 hours, simply breathing, running the new information over and over, trying to fit it into the case I'd already built. Because a case that misunderstands its own central motive is a case that can be picked apart in cross-examination, and I needed, more than anything, for this to be unpickable. By the time I walked back into my house that evening, I had recalibrated everything. This was no longer simply a story about a husband who cheated and stole. This was a story about an entire ecosystem of people, a husband, a sister-in-law, a business partner, and a mistress whose true loyalties belonged to a rival firm, all of whom had, in their own way, betrayed the very family fortune they claimed to be protecting or extending. Each for their own reasons, each convinced their particular piece of the betrayal was small enough, contained enough, that it would never surface. None of them understood that I had spent 15 years learning exactly how to make hidden things surface, on exactly the timeline I chose. I called Robert Voss that night, told him what Marisol had found, and heard, for the first time in our entire 11-week partnership, real anger in his voice. Not at me, but at the situation. At a decade of watching Marcus get away with smaller and smaller versions of exactly this kind of recklessness, until it finally metastasized into something that threatened not just the family's money, but potentially Whitfield Development's standing with the city itself, given the bid-rigging implications. This changes the referral, Robert said. This isn't just wire fraud and embezzlement anymore. If Bianca Reyes really did funnel confidential bid data to a competitor, that's a separate potential fraud and antitrust issue, and Special Agent Okafor is going to want jurisdiction over both threads at once. I need to call her tomorrow morning. Elena, are you sure you want this to happen exactly the way we planned? At the gala? In front of everyone? I told him yes. I told him I had never been more sure of anything in my professional life. Because somewhere in those 48 hours of sitting with the new information, something had crystallized in me that went beyond simple revenge, beyond even the very real financial and emotional damage this family had done to me. I understood with total clarity that the only way to protect what remained of Whitfield Development, the company Harold Whitfield Sr. had built with his own hands over 41 years, the company that employed 612 people who had nothing to do with any of this, was to cut out every rotted piece simultaneously, publicly, undeniably, in a single decisive strike that would leave no room for any of them to quietly negotiate their way back into positions of trust. A slow bleed doesn't save a body. Sometimes you have to open the whole wound at once, in front of witnesses, so it can finally, actually heal. The gala was 6 days away. Loop A, the money, was almost fully documented, waiting only on the final confirmation from Special Agent Denise Okafor's team. Loop B, the betrayal, had just widened into something far larger and stranger than I'd expected. A betrayal that touched not just my marriage, but the entire foundation of the company Marcus's own father had spent his life building. Loop C, how exactly I intended to bring all of it crashing down in front of 320 guests, was the only piece left to finalize, and Robert Voss and I spent the next 4 days doing exactly that, with a precision that, looking back now, still surprises even me. Special Agent Denise Okafor came to Robert Voss's office 4 days before the gala, a tall, unhurried woman in her mid-40s with the kind of quiet, exhaustive attention to detail that I recognized instantly, professionally, as a kindred spirit. Someone who, like me, had built a career out of the specific, patient satisfaction of watching a lie collapse under the weight of its own inconsistencies. She spent 3.5 hours going through my full 53-page report, now expanded to 71 pages with the addition of the bid-rigging evidence Marisol had uncovered, asking sharp, precise questions, occasionally pausing to make notes in a small leather notebook she carried instead of a laptop, a detail I found, in the middle of everything else, almost comforting. This is one of the more thorough private forensic packages I've seen handed to us in 11 years, she told me, near the end of that first meeting. And I mean that as a genuine compliment, not flattery. Most of what we get from spouses in situations like this is emotional, scattered, admissible for maybe 1/10 of what they think it proves. This is different. This is actually usable. She looked at me for a long moment. You built a wire fraud case against your own husband with the same discipline you'd use on a stranger. That's rare, Mrs. Cross. Ms. Cross, I corrected her gently. And it wasn't discipline, it was just math, eventually. The love stopped being the biggest number in the equation a long time before I admitted it to myself. Agent Okafor's team spent the following 3 days corroborating the trail independently, subpoenaing bank records for Meridian Capital Holdings that confirmed, with federal authority behind them, everything Marisol and I had traced privately, pulling phone records that placed Marcus and Trevor Locke in direct, frequent contact with the shell company's registered agent in Delaware. And, most critically, securing a preliminary warrant tied to the encrypted email attachments Bianca Reyes had received from Marcus's internal Whitfield development account. Attachments that, once partially decrypted under the federal warrant's authority, turned out to contain exactly what we suspected: detailed cost breakdowns and bid strategy documents for 2 Whitfield projects that Aldous and Kerr had subsequently, suspiciously, undercut. By the day before the gala, Agent Okafor confirmed to Robert and me in a tense, quiet call I took from my car in a grocery store parking lot because I couldn't risk having this conversation anywhere inside my own house, that her team had enough for arrest warrants. Not just for Marcus and Trevor on wire fraud and embezzlement charges, but potentially for Bianca Reyes as well, on charges related to trade secret theft and wire fraud connected to the leaked bid data, pending further review overnight. We'll have agents in position tomorrow evening, she told me. But Ms. Cross, I need you to understand, once this starts, it doesn't stop for anyone's comfort. Not yours, not the family's, not the guests. If you want this handled quietly, now is the last moment to say so. I told her I did not want it handled quietly. I told her, in fact, that quiet was the one thing this family had used for 41 years to protect itself, and that quiet was exactly what I intended to end. There was one more piece of the plan left to finalize, and it was, in some ways, the hardest conversation of the entire 11 weeks. Not because it involved confrontation, but because it required trust, a resource I had almost entirely stopped extending to anyone connected to the Whitfield name. I needed to bring Harold Whitfield Sr. into a version of the truth, at least partially, before the gala, because Robert and I had agreed that ambushing a 73-year-old man in front of 320 guests with no warning at all, watching him learn in real time that his son had been stealing from him for over a year, felt less like justice and more like unnecessary cruelty to the one person in that family who had, in his own imperfect way, always treated me fairly. I met Harold 2 days before the gala, alone, at Robert's suggestion, in Robert's office rather than anywhere connected to the family. I brought a condensed 4-page summary, the essential facts, no unnecessary detail, delivered the way I would deliver bad news to any client, directly, without softening, without drama. Harold read the 4 pages twice, exactly the way Robert had read the first 6 pages 7 weeks earlier, and when he finally looked up at me, his face had gone the color of old paper, gray and thin, and for a moment I saw not the imposing patriarch who had built a $210 million company from a single strip mall parking lot, but simply an old man discovering, all at once, that the son he'd trusted with his life's work had been quietly gutting it for 19 months. "Does my wife know?" he asked, finally, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "No," I said. "Diane doesn't know about the money. I believe Caroline may have known about parts of the personal situation for some time and did not disclose it. That will need to be Agent Okafor's determination, not mine, whether Caroline's silence rises to the level of any legal obligation. But no, Harold, Diane doesn't know any of it." Harold sat in silence for nearly a full minute, staring at the 4th page, at the total figure, $841,600, circled in my own handwriting. "Why didn't you come to me the moment you found out?" he asked, not unkindly, more genuinely curious than accusatory. "Because the moment I came to you with anything less than an airtight, federally corroborated case," I said, "Marcus would have found a lawyer, found a way to frame it as a misunderstanding, found some version of events where he pays back a fraction of it quietly, and everyone agrees to move on for the sake of the family name. I've watched this family protect itself from consequences for 11 years, Harold. I wasn't going to hand you something soft enough for that to happen again. I built something no one in this family can talk their way out of." Harold Whitfield Sr. looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Grief, yes, but underneath it, something that looked almost like pride. The specific, complicated pride of a man realizing the daughter-in-law he'd always quietly respected had just done, more thoroughly and more fairly than he ever could have, exactly what needed to be done to save the company that was his entire life's work. "The gala," he said finally. "It goes forward as planned?" "It goes forward exactly as planned," I said. "You'll give your toast. The groundbreaking announcement happens on schedule, and at the appropriate moment, Agent Okafor's team moves in. I need you to trust me on the timing, Harold. I need you to let me handle this the way I've built it." He nodded, slowly, and then he said something I have carried with me every single day since. "Elena, I've spent 41 years building this company, and in one evening you're about to save it from something I never even saw coming. From inside my own family. I don't know how to thank you for that. I'm not sure I deserve to." I told him he didn't need to thank me. I told him the only thing I needed from him was to stand at that podium 2 nights later and give the toast he'd always planned to give, and let the rest unfold exactly as it was going to unfold, because by that point, nothing was going to stop it. Not his guilt, not Diane's fury, not Marcus's desperate, doomed attempts to explain away numbers that no longer had any explanation left in them. The final 48 hours before the gala passed in a strange, suspended quiet. I went to a fitting for the dress I would wear that night. A deep emerald green, floor length, the exact color, I noted with a coldness that almost made me smile, of old money, of the kind of quiet confidence this family had spent 11 years performing at me. I had my hair done. I answered 3 separate calls from Diane about seating arrangements, listened to her arrogance perform itself one final time as she informed me, without asking, that I would be seated at table 2 rather than at the head table beside Marcus. For optics, given how busy he'll be working the room. A decision I accepted with a graciousness that must have seemed, to Diane, like simple deference. And that was, in fact, exactly the seating arrangement I needed. Close enough to the stage to move quickly when the moment came. Far enough from Marcus that he wouldn't notice anything different about me until it was already far too late to matter. Marcus, for his part, spent those final 2 days almost entirely oblivious, distracted, buoyant even, the way a man behaves when he believes he's successfully hidden every version of his own rot for 19 months running. He kissed me goodnight the evening before the gala and told me, with a warmth that I recognized, now, as the specific warmth of a guilty man trying to reassure himself as much as his wife, that he was proud of us, of everything we'd built together. I told him I was proud too, and I meant every word of it, though not remotely in the way he understood it. I was proud, deeply, coldly proud, of the 71-page report sitting on an encrypted drive, of 11 weeks of discipline that had never once cracked, of a case built strong enough to end not just a marriage but an entire architecture of theft and betrayal in a single, decisive public evening. That night, I slept better than I had in 11 weeks. I knew exactly what was coming. For the first time since the parking lot of the Wickham Grand, I was no longer the person something was happening to. I was the person making it happen. The cathedral room on the evening of the gala held 320 guests under a ceiling of restored 1920s ironwork and crystal chandeliers, round tables draped in ivory linen, a 12-piece orchestra playing something quiet and classical near the far wall, and at the center of it all, a raised stage with a podium bearing the Whitfield Development Group crest, prepared for what everyone in that room believed was simply the celebratory groundbreaking announcement for the $84 million Meridian Business Park. Waiters moved between tables with trays of champagne. Dom Perignon, I noted with a private, bitter irony, the same label Marcus had carried into a hotel room 11 weeks earlier, and the low hum of 300 conversations filled the room with the specific, self-satisfied warmth of old money enjoying itself in public. I arrived at 7:04 p.m. in the emerald green dress, my hair swept back the way I'd had it done that afternoon, and I found my seat at table 2 exactly where Diane had assigned it, close enough to the stage, exactly as planned. Robert Voss caught my eye from across the room within minutes of my arrival, a small, almost imperceptible nod, and I understood the message instantly. Agent Okafor's team was already in position, dispersed among the catering staff and a small cluster of unfamiliar men in dark suits near the rear exits who anyone not specifically looking for them would have assumed were simply additional event security. Marcus found me at 7:20, kissed my cheek, told me I looked beautiful, and I told him he looked handsome too, and meant it in the flattest, most technical sense possible, the way I might note that a set of fraudulent books had been dressed up nicely before an audit. He moved off to work the room the way he always did at these events, shaking hands, laughing at jokes, standing a little too close to investors he was hoping to charm, entirely unaware that every conversation he had that evening was, functionally, his last as a free man for the foreseeable future. Trevor Locke arrived at 7:35, in a tuxedo that cost, I happen to know from Marisol's research, $4,200, purchased 11 days earlier from a boutique downtown, paid for with a credit card linked, 3 layers removed, to Meridian Capital Holdings, a detail so perfectly, almost poetically damning that I found myself, standing near the bar with a glass of champagne I never intended to drink, having to suppress something that was almost a laugh. Bianca Reyes arrived at 7:41, seated, according to the place cards I'd reviewed with Robert 2 days earlier, at a table near the back reserved for event vendors and support staff. A seating choice Marcus had clearly fought for and lost, unable to secure her a more prominent placement without raising questions from Diane, whose sharp, arrogant eye missed almost nothing when it came to the optics of her own events. Bianca wore black, understated, the careful understatement of someone trying not to be noticed by anyone who mattered, and she caught my eye once, briefly, across the room, and looked away quickly, the same flicker of calculation I'd seen in the cathedral room lobby the week before. Diane Whitfield, resplendent in a gown the color of champagne itself, worked the room like a woman who had never once in her life doubted her own centrality to any event she attended, greeting city council members and major donors with the practiced warmth of someone who understood, instinctively, that every handshake was a transaction, every smile an investment in the family's continued social capital. Caroline arrived with Preston at 7:50, and I watched her scan the room the way she always did, quickly, appraisingly, checking who else had arrived, where she ranked in the evening's unspoken social hierarchy, and I watched, too, the exact moment her eyes found Bianca's table near the back. A half-second glance, gone almost before it registered, but I registered it, because by that point in the evening I was watching everything. At 8:15, the orchestra quieted, and Harold Whitfield Sr. took the stage to warm, sustained applause. He looked, from where I sat, exactly as composed as I had asked him to be. A 73-year-old man carrying grief and betrayal underneath a public face that had been trained, over 5 decades in business, never to show a single crack in front of a room full of people whose confidence his company depended on. He spoke for 11 minutes, thanking the room for their partnership, describing the vision for the Meridian Business Park, the 612 jobs it would create, the 41 years of work that had led to this moment. Every word true, every word delivered with a steadiness that made my chest tighten with something that, in another life, might have been simple admiration for a man doing something genuinely difficult with real grace. At 8:26, Harold reached the part of his toast Robert and I had discussed 2 days earlier, a line that had always been part of the planned remarks, entirely unrelated to anything I'd told him. A simple, sincere sentence thanking the people who keep this family's foundation strong, seen, and unseen. And it was on that exact word, unseen, that I rose from my seat at table 2, smoothed the front of my emerald dress, and walked toward the stage. I want to tell you honestly that I don't remember every step of that walk. I remember the click of my heels against the parquet floor, unnaturally loud in my own ears even over the orchestra's quiet underscore. I remember 320 faces beginning to turn, slowly, the way a room turns when something unplanned interrupts its rhythm. I remember catching Marcus's expression from across the room, confusion first, then, as I climbed the 2 steps onto the stage, something closer to alarm, the specific alarm of a man realizing, in real time, that whatever was about to happen was not part of any script he understood. I reached the podium. Harold stepped back, exactly as we'd rehearsed, and handed me the small handheld microphone with a steadiness I will be grateful for as long as I live. And I looked out over 320 guests, investors, city officials, family friends, Diane's champagne-colored gown catching the chandelier light near the front, Caroline's hand frozen halfway to her wine glass, Trevor Locke's easy smile beginning, almost imperceptibly, to falter, and I began to speak. "Good evening," I said. "My name is Elena Cross. Most of you know me as Marcus Whitfield's wife. For the past 11 weeks, I have also been the lead forensic investigator on a federal case involving $841,600 embezzled from this company's active construction escrows, funneled through a shell entity called Meridian Capital Holdings, which, I want to be very precise about this, because precision is the only thing that has mattered to me for the last 11 weeks, was jointly controlled by my husband, Marcus Whitfield, and his business partner, Trevor Locke." The room did not gasp, not immediately. 320 people trained by decades of politeness to assume, for one merciful extra second, that they had misheard something. I watched the confusion ripple outward from the tables closest to the stage, watched Diane's champagne-colored gown go rigid, watched Marcus, halfway across the room, go the color of the tablecloths. "I'd also like to note," I continued, my voice steady, level, the exact tone I use when presenting findings to a client's board, that this same investigation uncovered evidence that confidential bid data from at least 2 Whitfield development projects was leaked to a competing firm, Aldous & Kerr, over the past 14 months, via an individual with whom my husband has been conducting an affair since shortly after our 10th wedding anniversary. Her name is Bianca Reyes, and I believe she's seated at table 17 this evening." 320 heads turned, almost as one, toward the back of the room, toward a woman in a black dress who had just realized, with the same flicker of calculation I'd seen twice before, that there was no version of this evening left in which she could quietly disappear before every eye in the cathedral room found her. Marcus finally moved, pushing through the crowd toward the stage, his face contorted into something between fury and panic, calling my name in a voice that cracked halfway through the second syllable. "Elena, what the hell are you doing? This is insane. You don't understand." "I understand $841,600, I said into the microphone, not raising my voice, because I didn't need to. The room had gone silent enough that I could have whispered and still been heard in the back row. "I understand 17 fabricated change orders on the Meridian Business Park project alone. I understand a second home equity line you opened against a rental property I didn't even remember we owned. I understand a pair of diamond earrings from Halloran and Wick, purchased 6 days after you told me to spend our anniversary alone. I understand all of it, Marcus, in more detail than you probably do yourself, because I've spent 11 weeks building a case, and I built it well." That was the moment the men near the rear exits moved. Special Agent Denise Okafor stepped forward from where she'd been standing, unnoticed, near a service door for the past 40 minutes, flanked by 4 agents in dark suits who had, until that exact second, blended seamlessly into the evening's staffing. "Marcus Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying with the flat, practiced authority of someone who had done this exact walk hundreds of times before, "you're under arrest for wire fraud and embezzlement. Trevor Locke, same charges apply to you. Please remain where you are." I watched Trevor Locke's opportunism perform itself one final time, right there in front of 320 witnesses. a fast, desperate scan of the exits, a half step toward the nearest door, immediately blocked by an agent who had clearly anticipated exactly that move. Trevor's smooth, easy charm evaporated in an instant, replaced by something raw and ugly, and I heard him say, to no one in particular, to the room at large, "This is a misunderstanding. I can explain the accounting. This is a business dispute, not, this isn't," before an agent's hand closed firmly around his arm, and the sentence died unfinished. Marcus, for his part, did something I hadn't fully anticipated even after 11 weeks of planning for every version of this moment. He turned, not toward the agents approaching him, but toward his father, standing just behind me on the stage, and said, in a voice stripped of every ounce of the polish he'd spent his whole life cultivating, "Dad, please, tell them this is a mistake, tell them." Harold Whitfield Sr. looked at his son for a long, terrible moment, 320 guests holding their collective breath, and said, quietly enough that only those of us on and near the stage could fully hear it, "I read the report, Marcus. I read every page. There's no mistake in it." Then he turned away, and I watched a 73-year-old man who had built a $210 million company from nothing find, from somewhere, the strength to simply stand there, steady, while agents led his only son past 320 of his closest business relationships and out through the cathedral room's grand front entrance in handcuffs. Diane Whitfield's arrogance in its final performance of the evening did not crack into grief or shock the way I might have expected. It curdled, instantly, into fury, and she rose from her seat and crossed toward the stage with a speed I hadn't known a woman in 4-inch heels could manage, jabbing a finger toward me and hissing, loud enough now that half the room could hear, "You did this. You planned this, you humiliated this family in front of everyone we know. How dare you?" "Diane," I said, and I let, for the first time in 11 years, every ounce of the deference I'd performed for her drop entirely out of my voice. "Your son stole $841,000 from a company your husband spent 41 years building. He did that, not me. I just made sure everyone finally saw it." Caroline Whitfield Hayes had not moved from her seat, and I watched, from the stage, as two of Agent Okafor's team approached her table directly, one of them speaking quietly, and I watched Caroline's entitled composure finally completely dissolve, her hand flying to her mouth, Preston beside her going rigid with the specific horror of a man realizing his wife's name was about to be attached, in some capacity yet to be determined, to a federal fraud investigation. Bianca Reyes, at table 17, had already been approached by a fifth agent I hadn't clocked earlier, standing quietly beside her chair, and I watched her face cycle through the same flicker of calculation one final time, searching, uselessly, for an exit that had never actually existed. I set the microphone down on the podium. Harold reached out and, without a word, took my hand and held it for a moment, the way you'd hold the hand of someone who had just performed surgery on your own family and somehow saved more of it than anyone had thought possible. And in the strange, ringing silence that followed, 320 guests frozen somewhere between shock and the specific electric thrill of witnessing something they would talk about for years, I stepped down off that stage, alone, in my emerald green dress, and walked back to table 2, and sat down, and finished the glass of champagne I had never intended to drink, because for the first time in 11 weeks, there was nothing left to plan, nothing left to build, nothing left to hide. The case, everyone in that room, was finally, entirely closed. I want to tell you what happened to each of them, in order, over the 14 months that followed that night in the cathedral room, because I think the specific shape of each consequence matters more than a general sense that justice was served. Justice, in my experience, is rarely a single dramatic moment. It's usually a long, slow unwinding, and I watched every single thread of it unwind with the same patience I'd used to build the case in the first place. Marcus was indicted 11 days after the gala on federal charges of wire fraud and embezzlement, formally, in writing, by the U.S. Attorney's Office, 41 counts in total, one for each year his father had spent building the company he'd helped hollow out. His bail was set at $300,000, which Harold, after 4 days of what I understand was a genuinely agonizing internal debate, ultimately declined to post, telling Robert Voss, in a conversation Robert later relayed to me almost word for word, that a man has to be allowed to face what he built, even when the man is your own son. Marcus spent 19 days in county custody before a private bail bondsman, arranged not by his family but by Bianca Reyes's own increasingly panicked mother, posted a reduced bond after a hearing lowered the figure. It didn't matter much in the end. 8 months later, facing overwhelming documentary evidence, my 71-page report, now folded into a federal case file running past 400 pages, Marcus pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a recommendation of leniency on sentencing, and was sentenced to 4 years in a minimum security federal facility, along with a restitution order requiring him to repay, over the following 15 years, every dollar of the $841,600 he had stolen, a debt that will follow him, structurally, for most of the remainder of his working life. He wrote me one letter from that facility, 6 months into his sentence, 3 pages long, apologizing in language I recognized, even through the apparent sincerity, as still fundamentally about himself, his fear, his regret, his hope that I might someday understand the pressure he'd been under. I read it once, I did not respond. I do not intend to. Trevor Locke fared worse, in some ways, because Trevor, unlike Marcus, had no family fortune left to draw on for legal defense and no father willing to quietly absorb any portion of the fallout on his behalf. Trevor's defense attorney attempted, unsuccessfully, to argue that Trevor had been merely following Marcus's direction, a defense that collapsed almost immediately once federal investigators produced internal emails, recovered under warrant from Trevor's own business account, showing that the 11% invoice inflation scheme had, in fact, originated with Trevor 2 full years before Marcus was ever pulled into it, back when Trevor had first begun quietly skimming from a smaller Whitfield project to cover his own mounting personal debts. Trevor was convicted on all counts after declining a plea deal, sentenced to 6 years, 2 more than Marcus, a distinction the judge specifically noted in sentencing as reflecting Trevor's role as the scheme's original architect, and stripped of every professional license and certification tied to his general contractor's business, which itself collapsed within 4 months of his arrest as clients, one after another, quietly severed ties. The last I heard, secondhand, through Robert, Trevor's wife of 9 years, filed for divorce the week of his sentencing and moved with their 2 children to live near her own family in another state, taking with her whatever remained of the life Trevor's opportunism had briefly, precariously funded. Bianca Reyes's case took a different, stranger shape than any of the others, because the federal investigation into the leaked bid data ultimately determined that while Bianca had in fact transmitted confidential Whitfield development documents to a contact connected to Aldous and Kerr, prosecutors were unable to conclusively prove she'd done so with full knowledge that the information constituted federally protected trade secrets, rather than simple industry gossip passed along out of personal grievance against the family that had beaten her ex-fiancé's firm. A legal distinction that, while narrow, was enough for her attorneys to negotiate a plea to a single reduced charge, avoiding federal prison but resulting in 3 years of probation, a permanent felony record, and a civil suit from Whitfield Development itself seeking recovery of the estimated $1.1 million in lost margin the leaked data had cost the company across 2 undercut projects. I understand, again secondhand, that Bianca's event planning business, which had depended heavily on referrals from the exact social circle that had watched her exposed in front of 320 witnesses that night, essentially ceased to exist within 6 weeks of the gala. She relocated, I'm told, to a city several states away, and started over under a name that was not, strictly speaking, a legal alias, but was close enough to one that I doubt anyone she meets there connects her to the woman who once stood at table 17 in a black dress, waiting for an exit that never came. Caroline Whitfield Hayes was never criminally charged. The investigation ultimately concluded that while she had known about both the affair and, likely, at least some portion of Bianca's connection to Aldous and Kerr, prosecutors could not establish that her silence rose to the level of active criminal facilitation, rather than simple, ordinary family loyalty, misapplied in service of covering for her brother. But the social consequences, for Caroline, proved in some ways more permanent than a criminal record might have been. Diane, in the aftermath, blamed Caroline almost as much as she blamed Marcus, for having brought that woman into this family in the first place, a resentment that fractured the relationship between mother and daughter in ways I understand, from occasional secondhand updates through mutual acquaintances, have never fully healed. Preston Hayes, Caroline's husband, quietly moved their family's finances into accounts entirely separate from any Whitfield-adjacent structure within weeks of the gala, and while the marriage itself survived, several people who know them well have described it since as noticeably, permanently cooler than it once was. Caroline's entitlement, the trait that had defined her at every family dinner for 11 years, seems, from what little I still hear of her, to have curdled into something quieter and more brittle. the entitlement of someone who has finally, belatedly, discovered that the family name she'd always assumed would shield her from every consequence had limits after all. Diane Whitfield's arrogance, unlike Caroline's entitlement, did not curdle or soften in the aftermath. If anything, in the immediate weeks following the gala, it hardened into something closer to denial, a determined public insistence, at the handful of social events she still attended, that the entire evening had been a misunderstanding blown wildly out of proportion by an overly ambitious daughter-in-law. That narrative lasted almost exactly as long as it took the first news coverage of Marcus's guilty plea to circulate through the same social circles Diane had spent decades cultivating. I'm told, again, secondhand, because Diane and I have not spoken directly since that night, that her standing on two prominent charity boards was quietly, gracefully not renewed the following year, the kind of soft social exile that families like the Whitfields understand perfectly well without anyone ever having to say the actual words out loud. Diane still lives in the Ridgemont Hills estate with Harold. I understand their marriage has continued, though what remains of it after everything is not something I feel entitled to speculate on. Some fortunes, once revealed to be resting on rot, simply have to be lived inside anyway, because the alternative, starting over entirely at 71 years old, is its own kind of impossible. Harold Whitfield Sr., in the months following the gala, did something that surprised even Robert Voss, who had known him for 31 years. He restructured Whitfield Development Group's entire governance model, adding independent financial oversight, quarterly third-party audits, and, this is the part that still catches in my throat a little when I think about it, a permanent, formal advisory role for me, Elena Cross, as the company's independent forensic compliance consultant. A role I accepted not for the money, though the retainer is generous, but because I understood, watching a 73-year-old man rebuild his own trust in the world, one careful safeguard at a time, that I wanted to be part of making sure nothing like this ever happened inside that company again. Harold and I have dinner together, just the two of us, on the third Sunday of every month now, a quieter, smaller echo of the family dinners that used to fill that house with people who, it turned out, had been hiding so much from each other. He told me, at the most recent one, that the company posted its strongest year in company history the year after the scandal. A fact he delivered not with triumph, but with the specific, weathered relief of a man who had nearly lost everything he'd built and understood. Finally, exactly how close it had come. As for me, I filed for divorce 9 days after the gala, and it was finalized 6 months later, uncontested, on terms that gave me, among other things, full retention of Ashcroft Analytics and every dollar it had ever earned, an amount Marcus's attorney never once seriously challenged, likely because contesting anything at that point would have required Marcus's legal team to spend hours combing back through exactly the kind of documentation I'd spent 11 weeks building against him. My consulting business, which I had built quietly on the side for years, grew substantially in the year following the divorce. Word travels fast in certain professional circles about a forensic accountant who built and executed a case this thorough, this precise, this complete, and I now run a firm with 11 employees, specializing almost entirely in exactly the kind of internal fraud detection that once, quietly, saved my own father-in-law's company from the inside out. I bought a house of my own, 6 months after the divorce was finalized, smaller than the one on Birchwood Lane, but entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. Purchased with money no one else had ever touched. No one else could ever quietly siphon away through a hillock I hadn't known existed. I sleep well there. I sleep, most nights, better than I slept for the last several years of my marriage, because I no longer carry the low, constant hum of a lie I hadn't yet identified but had, on some level, always felt underneath the surface of my own life. People ask me sometimes, at the dinners and industry panels I occasionally speak at now, whether I regret the way I handled it, whether a quieter divorce, a private settlement, might have spared everyone the public spectacle of that night in the cathedral room. I always give them the same answer, because it's the truest thing I know. I didn't do what I did for spectacle. I did it because I spent 15 years of my career learning that quiet is exactly how fraud survives, exactly how families like the Whitfields protect themselves from consequence generation after generation, and exactly how women like me get underestimated, again and again, by people who assume that a soft voice and a willingness to smile through insults means there's nothing sharp underneath. There was always something sharp underneath. It just took 11 weeks, one parking lot, and $841,600 for the rest of them to finally, publicly, find that out for themselves. I think, too, about the wedding itself, 11 years earlier, because in the strange months after the divorce was finalized, I found myself returning to that day more than I expected to. Not with grief exactly, but with a kind of forensic curiosity about my own past. The same instinct that had let me trace $841,000 through a shell company now turned inward on my own history, looking for the earliest tell I had missed. We married on a Saturday in June at the Ridgemont Hills estate, under a white tent on the back lawn overlooking the same gardens where, 11 years later, I would sit through countless Sunday dinners listening to Diane's arrogance perform itself on schedule. I wore my mother's veil, a delicate ivory lace that had survived 3 generations of cross women, and I remember standing at the top of the aisle, my father's arm under mine, watching Marcus wait for me at the altar in a way that, at the time, felt like the single most certain moment of my entire life. I've gone back since and thought hard about the small things I noticed that day and dismissed, because hindsight is its own kind of forensic tool, and I think it's worth telling you what I found, because I suspect some of you watching this have your own version of these small dismissed details sitting somewhere in your memory too. Marcus's best man toast that night, delivered by Trevor Locke, contained a line, delivered as a joke, met with warm laughter from the entire tent, about how Marcus had always had a talent for finding money nobody else could see, a line I laughed at along with everyone else. A line that, 11 years later, reads less like an affectionate joke about business savvy and more like an accidental confession, hiding in plain sight, about a talent that had already, even then, likely included finding money that belonged to other people. I remember, too, a smaller moment from the reception itself. Diane, 3 glasses of champagne in, pulling me aside near the dessert table and telling me, with what I understood then as simple mother-in-law bluntness and understand now as something closer to an unintentional warning, Marcus has always needed someone to manage things for him, Elena. He's brilliant with people, terrible with details. You'll figure that part out soon enough. I laughed it off that night the same way I laughed off her comment at the rehearsal dinner, filing it under the general category of Diane being Diane, never once considering that terrible with details might, in practice, mean something as specific and as damaging as 19 months of fabricated invoices and an $841,000 hole in a company's escrow accounts. The early years of the marriage were, by most external measures, genuinely good ones, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think it's a disservice to the truth of this story to pretend the whole 11 years was some slow-motion catastrophe I simply failed to notice. Marcus and I traveled together, Portugal, twice, a month in Southeast Asia, the year before Ashcroft Analytics took off, and my own schedule became too demanding for extended trips. We built a genuinely close friendship underneath the marriage, the kind where we could sit in comfortable silence for an entire evening, and it never once felt like absence. I think, looking back now with the clarity of everything I eventually learned, that Marcus's gambling debts began somewhere around year 6 or 7, based on the earliest irregular withdrawal patterns Marisol was able to trace, which means the first 5 or 6 years of our marriage were, as far as I can determine, largely what they appeared to be: imperfect, ordinary, real. It was somewhere in that 6th or 7th year that something in Marcus started to erode, quietly, invisibly, the same way water erodes a foundation for years before anyone notices the first visible crack in the wall above it. I mention all of this not to soften what he ultimately did, but because I think the version of this story that's easiest to tell, a monster who was always a monster, a marriage that was always a lie, is actually less useful, less true, and less protective for anyone watching this who might be sitting inside their own version of a marriage that used to be real and has since started, quietly, to rot. The lesson isn't that you should have seen it coming from day one. The lesson is that you have to keep watching, keep paying attention, even inside a marriage that feels safe, because the erosion doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates, year after year, until one Thursday night in a hotel parking lot forces you to finally add up everything you'd been quietly not quite noticing all along. The federal trial proceedings themselves, which unfolded over the 8 months following the gala, gave me a strange kind of front-row education in exactly how thoroughly the system works once a case is built correctly. I sat through 11 days of pre-trial hearings, watching Marcus's expensive defense attorney, a man named Charles Bellamy, retained with money that, I noted with a certain grim satisfaction, came entirely from a personal loan against Diane and Harold's estate, rather than from any asset actually belonging to Marcus. Since nearly everything of his had by then been frozen pending the restitution order, attempt repeatedly to characterize the $841,000 as a series of internal accounting disputes rather than deliberate theft, a strategy that collapsed, predictably, under the weight of the wire transfer documentation, the Shell Company Incorporation records, and Gerald Fitch's voluntary testimony about the timeline of irregularities he'd noticed and failed to escalate. I testified for a total of 6 hours across 2 days, walking the court through my own forensic methodology with the same clinical precision I'd use presenting findings to any client's board. And I remember distinctly the moment during cross-examination when Bellamy attempted to suggest that my investigation had been motivated by marital vindictiveness rather than genuine forensic rigor. And I remember answering him, calmly, that vindictiveness doesn't produce documents that survive federal subpoena, corroborated bank records, and independent FBI verification. Accuracy does, and I'd simply been accurate. I watched 2 jurors nod, almost imperceptibly, at that answer, and I understood, in that exact moment, that whatever else this trial took from me, it would not take the one thing I'd spent 15 years building my entire professional identity around: the simple, durable fact that my numbers were always, always right. There's a particular afternoon from the trial I haven't told anyone about in this kind of detail, because it's the one moment during those 8 months where I came close to feeling something like sympathy for Marcus. And I think it's important to include it, because I promised you honesty, not just triumph. It was during a recess on the 9th day of testimony, and I found myself alone with him for perhaps 90 seconds in a hallway outside the courtroom, an accident of timing neither of our attorneys had planned for. He looked smaller than I remembered him. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by a single gray suit that had started to hang slightly loose on him after months of stress in county custody, and his face had the specific gray pallor of a man who had spent a great deal of time recently confronting exactly what he'd become. He looked at me and said quietly, "I keep trying to figure out the exact day I decided this was okay. I can't find it, Elena. I don't think there was one day. I think it was 1,000 small days, each one just slightly worse than the last, until I couldn't remember what the floor used to look like." I didn't answer him. I'm not sure there was an answer that would have been either true or kind, and I've never been willing to offer him one that was kind at the expense of true. I simply nodded, once, and walked back into the courtroom, and that was the last extended conversation Marcus and I ever had that wasn't conducted entirely through attorneys. I think about that hallway sometimes, still, not because it changes anything about what I did or what I'd do again without hesitation, but because I think it's worth being honest that even the clearest, most justified reckoning carries its own residue of grief, and pretending otherwise would make this story less useful to anyone watching who's standing at the edge of their own version of this decision. You can be completely right to expose someone, completely justified in ending something, and still feel the specific, complicated ache of mourning a version of a person who, it turns out, only ever partially existed. Both things were true for me. I let both things be true, and I kept working anyway, because feeling something honestly has never once, in my experience, been a reason to stop doing the necessary thing. I also want to tell you more about what happened in the immediate aftermath at the cathedral room, because I've told you the broad strokes. The arrests, Diane's fury, Caroline's collapse, but there are smaller details from that night that have stayed with me. Details I think matter. After I stepped down from the stage and returned to table 2, I sat there for nearly 20 minutes while the room slowly, chaotically reorganized itself around the absence of Marcus and Trevor, both now gone, led out through the grand entrance in handcuffs, while 320 guests either stared in open shock or, in a smaller number of cases, quietly began gathering their things to leave before the situation could touch them by association. A city councilwoman I'd met exactly twice before, a woman named Patricia Nguyen, came and sat beside me at table 2 without asking, poured herself the remainder of my untouched glass of champagne, and said, simply, "That took more courage than anything I've watched happen in a public room in 20 years of politics. I hope you know that." I thanked her. I don't remember much else about what she said after that, because I was, I think, somewhere in the early stages of a very specific kind of adrenaline crash, the kind that comes after 11 weeks of sustained, disciplined focus suddenly, finally releasing all at once. Robert Voss found me not long after, sat down across from me, and simply said, "You did exactly what you said you'd do." Every piece of it. I remember asking him, half joking, half genuinely uncertain, whether he thought I'd done the right thing, and I remember him looking at me with an expression I'd never quite seen on his face before, something almost paternal, something that, coming from a man who had spent 31 years protecting this family's interests with an almost surgical detachment, meant more to me than I expected it to. Elena, he said, I've watched 3 generations of people marry into this family. Most of them either got absorbed into its worst habits or got chewed up and spit out by them. You're the first person I've ever seen do neither. You didn't get absorbed and you didn't get chewed up. You built something stronger than the thing that tried to consume you, and then you used it to save the only part of this family actually worth saving. I still think about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me that entire year. The days immediately following the gala were, in some ways, harder than the 11 weeks of investigation that preceded them, because for 11 weeks I had a clear, singular task: build the case, document everything, hold the line until the moment was right. And once that moment passed, once the case was closed and the arrests were made, I found myself, for the first time in nearly 3 months, without a defined next task, sitting in a house that no longer felt entirely like mine, surrounded by furniture Marcus and I had picked out together, in a life that had been, until 11 weeks earlier, built around a version of the future that no longer existed. I filed for divorce on day 9, not because I needed more time to decide. I'd decided that in a parking lot at 9:12 p.m. 3 months earlier, but because Robert had advised me to let the federal case establish its own documentary record first, ensuring the divorce proceedings wouldn't be complicated by parallel disputes over which court had jurisdiction over specific frozen assets. Those first few weeks alone in the Birchwood Lane house were quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in 11 years, and I want to tell you honestly that the quiet was, at first, disorienting rather than peaceful. I'd spend evenings sitting in rooms I used to share with another person, aware, in a low-grade, persistent way, of exactly how much of my own daily rhythm had been built around accommodating someone else's presence. Meals timed around his schedule. Silences filled with a habit of conversation I no longer needed to perform. It took roughly 2 months before that quiet stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like something closer to spaciousness, room I hadn't realized I'd been missing for years. I threw myself into Ashcroft Analytics during that period, partly out of genuine professional ambition and partly, I'll admit, because work had always been the one place I felt entirely uncomplicatedly competent, the one part of my life where the numbers told the truth and stayed told. Word of the case, not the tabloid version that eventually made its way into 2 regional business publications, but the professional version, the version that circulated through forensic accounting and corporate compliance circles, traveled faster than I expected. Within 4 months of the gala, I'd been approached by 6 new potential clients, specifically because of my role in the Whitfield case, 3 of whom became long-term retainer relationships that now form the backbone of my firm's client base. I hired my first employee, a sharp, meticulous young forensic analyst named Priya Chandrasekaran, 5 months after the divorce was finalized, and by the time I'm recording this, my firm employs 11 people across 2 offices, handling internal fraud investigations for companies who've learned, the hard way or otherwise, exactly how much can rot quietly inside an organization before anyone with the right training bothers to look closely enough to find it. I should also tell you more about Special Agent Denise Okafor, because our professional relationship didn't end when the case did. It evolved over the following year into something I genuinely call a friendship, forged in the specific way friendships sometimes form between 2 women who recognize, in each other, the exact same disciplined patience most people mistake for coldness. Denise and I met for coffee roughly every 6 weeks throughout the trial, ostensibly to discuss case logistics, though increasingly those conversations drifted into something more personal: her own 2-decade career in financial crimes, the specific toll of spending your working life documenting exactly how creatively people betray the ones who trust them most, and my own adjustment to a life I hadn't planned for at 34 years old. She told me once, over a coffee about 4 months after the gala, that in 21 years with the Bureau, she'd handled maybe a dozen cases where the initial private forensic package handed to her was strong enough to move directly to warrant applications without months of preliminary Bureau-side investigation first. You built something rare, she told me. Most people, even smart people, even furious people, don't have the discipline to sit on evidence like that for 11 weeks without letting it slip, without confronting the person, without doing something that tips your hand too early. You did. That's not just accounting skill. That's a specific kind of will. I asked her once, during one of those coffees, whether she'd ever worked a case that unsettled her the way this one clearly still, occasionally, unsettled me. the sense of having spent 11 weeks performing intimacy with someone you were simultaneously building a case to destroy. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me about an earlier case in her career, a mortgage fraud investigation where the whistleblower was a woman who had spent nearly a year gathering evidence against her own father, a man who had embezzled from an elderly care facility he ran, funneling funds meant for resident care into a lifestyle that left 3 residents without adequate medication for months. That woman, Denise said, used to tell me the hardest part wasn't building the case. It was that building the case required her to keep having Sunday dinners with him the entire time, to keep hugging him goodbye, to keep saying, "I love you, Dad," while she had a growing folder of evidence sitting in a locked drawer at her own apartment. She said something to me once that I've never forgotten. Loving someone and building a case against them aren't actually opposites. Sometimes the case is the most loving thing you can do. For everyone, that person is still going to hurt if nobody stops them. I've thought about that woman's words more times than I can count since Denise first told me about her, because I think they capture something true about what I did to Marcus, to Trevor, to this entire family, that a simpler word like revenge never quite manages to capture. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was stopping a wound that was going to keep widening, indefinitely, for everyone connected to it, until someone with the discipline to document it properly finally closed it. I want to tell you, too, about the 6 months of restructuring at Whitfield Development Group in more detail, because I think the specific mechanics of how a company rebuilds trust after discovering this kind of internal rot are genuinely useful, not just as a coda to my personal story, but as something anyone running or working inside an organization should understand. Harold brought in an outside governance consultant within 3 weeks of the gala, a firm specializing in post-fraud institutional recovery, and together we designed a compliance structure that, frankly, should have existed from the beginning. Quarterly third-party audits conducted by a rotating pool of independent forensic accountants, none of whom could serve more than 2 consecutive years to prevent exactly the kind of long-term, comfortable complacency that had let Gerald Fitch quietly not look for over 2 decades. A whistleblower reporting system with legal protections robust enough that an employee noticing irregularities wouldn't need to weigh that report against the risk of their own career, the way Gerald had for years, and a formal segregation of duties policy ensuring that no single individual, regardless of family relationship or seniority, could both approve and execute large financial transactions without a second, independent sign-off. I sat in on 11 of the 12 planning sessions that shaped that new structure, and I remember the specific satisfaction, quieter than the satisfaction of the gala itself, but in some ways more durable, of watching a 73-year-old man who had spent 41 years running his company almost entirely on personal trust and family loyalty slowly, carefully rebuild it instead on documentation and structural accountability, the exact values I'd spent my entire career believing in, and had just spent 11 weeks proving, in the most painful way possible, actually mattered more than trust ever could. Whitfield Development Group's first full year under the new structure posted revenue of $231 million, an increase of nearly 9% over the prior year, despite the reputational hit of the scandal, a number Harold attributes, when he tells this story to other business owners now, entirely to the fact that investors and city partners, once they understood the depth of the internal reforms, actually trusted the company more after the scandal than they had before it, precisely because they'd watched it respond to internal corruption with total transparency rather than quiet cover-up. The Meridian Business Park groundbreaking, delayed 4 months while the legal situation resolved, eventually proceeded on schedule, employing, in its first full year of construction, 631 workers, 19 more than the original projection, a detail Harold likes to mention with a specific, quiet pride whenever anyone asks him how the company recovered. I also want to spend a little more time on something I only touched on briefly, the way this entire experience changed how I understand my own profession, because I think it's the piece of this story that extends furthest beyond my own particular circumstances. Before all of this, I thought of forensic accounting as essentially a technical skill, a specialized form of pattern recognition applied to numbers rather than people. I understand it differently now. What I actually do, what I spent 11 weeks doing to my own husband, and, in a strange way, what I still do for every client who walks into my firm now, is bear witness to exactly the moment where someone's stated values and their actual behavior diverge, and then build a record precise enough that the divergence can no longer be denied, minimized, or quietly absorbed by the people with the most power to look away from it. Fraud, at its core, isn't really about money. It's about a story someone tells themselves and everyone around them, a story elaborate and convincing enough to survive years of scrutiny from people who love them, until someone with the right training, the right patience, and the right willingness to keep looking even when looking hurts, finally sits down and reads the actual numbers instead of the story built on top of them. There's a moment from the sentencing hearing itself, 8 months after the gala, that I haven't described yet, and I think it deserves its own space here because it was, in many ways, the true final closing of Loop A. Not the arrest, not the trial testimony, but the specific, formal moment. A federal judge read Marcus's sentence aloud in a courtroom that held, that day, a much smaller crowd than the cathedral room had 11 months earlier, maybe 30 people total, mostly attorneys, a handful of reporters from the 2 regional business publications that had covered the case, and, in the second row, Harold sitting alone, Diane having declined to attend, citing what her attorney later described to Robert as a scheduling conflict that everyone in the room understood was actually simply Diane's inability to sit through the formal cataloging of her son's crimes in a room full of strangers who might recognize her. Judge Miriam Castellano, a woman in her early 60s with a reputation, Robert told me beforehand, for handing down sentences that reflected genuine consideration of both harm and rehabilitation rather than pure punitive instinct, read through the specifics of the restitution order first. The $841,600 broken down into a payment schedule spanning 15 years, adjusted for interest, structured so that a portion would be automatically garnished from any future income Marcus earned above a minimal threshold for the rest of his working life if necessary. Then she addressed Marcus directly, and I remember her exact words because I wrote them down afterward, in the same legal pad I'd used to build the entire case 11 months earlier, because I felt, somehow, that they belonged in the same document. Mr. Whitfield, Judge Castellano said, what troubles me most about this case isn't the amount, though $841,000 is not a small sum by any measure. What troubles me is the duration. 19 months of sustained, deliberate deception, conducted against your own father's company, requiring you to look your own family in the eye, week after week, month after month, while actively working against their interests. That kind of sustained deception requires a particular kind of choice, made and remade, over and over, long after any single moment of weakness could explain it. I sentence people who make one terrible decision in a moment of desperation more leniently than I sentence people who make the same terrible decision, deliberately, 580 some times in a row. Marcus was sentenced to 4 years, as I mentioned earlier, but I want you to understand the specific weight of that particular sentence. 580 some times in a row. Judge Castellano's clerk had apparently calculated, roughly, the number of individual days across which the fraud had been actively maintained, and hearing that number spoken aloud in a federal courtroom did something to the room that I hadn't fully anticipated. I watched Marcus's shoulders drop, watched something in his posture finally completely collapse. Not from the length of the sentence itself, which his attorney had already prepared him for, but from hearing his betrayal quantified in that specific, granular way. Not as a single catastrophic mistake, but as hundreds of individual choices, made and remade, day after day, each one requiring its own small, deliberate act of continued deception. I sat in the 3rd row that day beside Robert Voss, and I felt, for the first time since the parking lot of the Wickham Grand, something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief, but existed somewhere adjacent to both, a sense of a very long, very careful process finally, formally, completely closing. When the hearing ended, Marcus turned, briefly, before the marshals led him out, and looked at me across the courtroom, and I want to tell you honestly that I don't know exactly what was in that look. Not anger anymore, not quite pleading either. Something closer to a kind of exhausted, final recognition. The look of a man, finally, completely out of stories to tell himself about what he'd done. I held his gaze for perhaps 3 seconds, and then I looked away, not out of discomfort, but because I understood, in that exact moment, that I had nothing left to say to him, that the 71-page report and Judge Castellano's sentence hadn't already said far more precisely than I ever could. I want to spend a little more time, too, on the specific texture of rebuilding a social life after a divorce this public, because it's a part of the story people rarely ask me about, more interested in the mechanics of the fraud investigation than in the quieter, slower work of figuring out who you are in a social world that watched your marriage end in front of 320 witnesses. In the immediate aftermath, I lost, by my own rough count, around a third of what I would have called my social circle during the marriage. Women I'd known through Marcus's side of the family, wives of his business associates, people whose friendship, it turned out, had been built more on proximity to the Whitfield name than on any genuine connection to me specifically. That loss stung less than I expected it to, honestly, because it clarified something I hadn't fully let myself see during the marriage: how much of my social world had been curated around Marcus's identity rather than my own. What surprised me more was who stayed, and who emerged. A handful of women from that old circle, not many, maybe 4, but the right 4, reached out in the weeks after the gala specifically to tell me they'd had their own private suspicions about Marcus for years, and had simply never known how or whether to say anything. And those relationships, freed from whatever performance had previously constrained them, became considerably deeper and more honest than they'd ever managed to be during the marriage. And I found, too, an entirely new circle forming around my professional life. Colleagues from the forensic accounting world, other founders in the small business consulting space, people who knew me first and primarily as Elena Cross, forensic accountant and firm owner, rather than as Marcus Whitfield's wife, a distinction that mattered more to my own sense of identity than I expected it to when the marriage first ended. I started, about 10 months after the divorce was finalized, dating again, carefully, slowly, and I want to be honest that it took real, deliberate work to relearn how to trust the specific, mundane details of another person's daily account of themselves. A work meeting that ran late, a phone left face down on a table, small, ordinary behaviors I now, involuntarily, sometimes still catalog with a forensic attentiveness I wish I could fully switch off but haven't entirely managed to, even now, more than a year out from everything. I've told the people I've dated since, early and directly, some version of this story, not for sympathy, but because I think it's fair for anyone getting close to me to understand exactly what kind of attention I'm capable of, and exactly why I'll never again be the kind of partner who simply accepts a convenient explanation without eventually, quietly, checking the math. I think often, too, about a conversation I had with my own mother, Rosalind Cross, about 4 weeks after the gala, because it's the conversation that helped me understand something about the entire 11-week process that I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. My mother had raised me alone from the time I was 7, after my father left, working double shifts as a hospital billing coordinator to put herself through night classes and eventually become a certified public accountant herself. The woman whose careful, exacting relationship with numbers I inherited long before I ever met Marcus or set foot inside the Whitfield family's world. She'd watched, from a careful distance, the entire arc of my marriage, never once voicing the specific reservations I now know she harbored, because she'd told herself, for 11 years, that it wasn't her place to interfere in a marriage that looked, from the outside, stable and successful. She came to visit me about 4 weeks after the gala, sat across from me at my new kitchen table in the smaller house I'd just started looking at, and said, "I want to tell you something I probably should have told you years ago. I never trusted how easily that family talked about money, Elena. Real money, money people actually worked for, doesn't get discussed the way the Whitfields discuss theirs. Casually, like weather, like something that simply happens to you rather than something you build. I used to watch Diane talk about a new car or a ski trip the way I'd talk about buying milk. And something in me always flinched, just a little, every single time. I asked her why she'd never said anything, and she looked at me for a long moment before answering. Honestly, because you seemed happy, and because I'd learned a long time ago that telling a grown daughter her marriage looks unstable rarely does anything except damage your relationship with her, without actually changing anything about the marriage itself. I decided instead to just make sure you always knew how to read a balance sheet well enough to protect yourself if you ever needed to. I suppose in the end, that turned out to matter more than any warning I could have given you directly. That conversation clarified something for me that I've carried since, the specific value and the specific limits of the way my mother chose to protect me. She never told me not to trust Marcus. She simply made sure from the time I was a teenager doing my own tax returns under her supervision that I had the tools to eventually find the truth myself, whenever I needed them, without ever having to depend on someone else to hand that truth to me. I think that's the version of protection I try to offer people now, both in my professional work and in how I talk about this story publicly. Not warnings, which people rarely heed anyway, especially inside a relationship that still feels on the surface like love, but tools. The ability to read your own numbers. The willingness to actually look at them even when looking is uncomfortable, even when the person you love would rather you didn't. I also want to tell you a little more about what happened with Priya Chandrasekaran, my first hire, because I think it illustrates something about how this entire experience reshaped not just my personal life, but the actual culture of the firm I built afterward. Priya joined me 5 months after the divorce, 26 years old, sharp, hungry, freshly credentialed, and during her first week, she asked me, directly, over lunch, why I'd built the firm's entire onboarding process around a specific principle she'd never encountered at her previous job. The principle that every single finding, no matter how small, gets documented in writing, dated, and preserved, even findings that seem, at the time, too minor to matter. I told her the truth that I'd learned, the hardest possible way, that the difference between a case that survives federal scrutiny and a case that collapses under cross-examination often comes down to exactly this kind of unglamorous, relentless documentation discipline, built and maintained long before you ever know whether you'll need it. Priya has since become the firm's second most senior forensic analyst, and she led, 18 months after joining, her own independent investigation into a mid-sized logistics company, where a regional operations director had been quietly diverting fuel reimbursement funds into a personal account for nearly 3 years, a case considerably smaller in scale than the Whitfield situation, only around $190,000 total, but handled, start to finish, with the exact same methodical, patient rigor I'd used to build my own case 11 weeks in a kitchen at 2 a.m. Watching her close that case, watching the discipline I'd built out of my own worst 11 weeks get passed forward into someone else's professional foundation, gave me a specific, quiet kind of satisfaction that I don't think I fully anticipated when I started the firm. The sense that something genuinely useful had been built out of something that had, at its origin, nearly destroyed me. I want to close this part of the story before I answer the question I asked you earlier by telling you about the very last conversation I had with Harold Whitfield Sr. before recording this video, because I think it captures something essential about where all of this eventually landed. We had our regular third Sunday dinner 2 weeks ago, just the two of us, at a smaller restaurant near his office, rather than the Ridgemont Hills estate. A change in venue he'd suggested about 6 months after the scandal and never explained. Though I've always suspected it was simply easier for him to build a new, uncomplicated ritual somewhere that didn't carry the weight of 41 years of family dinners that had, in the end, hidden so much from each other. Harold told me that evening that Marcus had recently applied for early consideration for a work release program, something his federal facility offers inmates who demonstrate sustained good behavior and have a documented restitution plan in progress, and that Marcus had asked, through his attorney, whether Harold might be willing to write a supporting letter. Harold hadn't decided yet, he told me, and he asked me directly whether I thought he should. I told him the truth, the same truth I've tried to hold on to through every part of this story, that forgiveness and accountability aren't actually opposites, and that a man can support his son's rehabilitation without ever again handing that son unsupervised access to anything of real value, financial or otherwise. Harold nodded slowly and said, "I think that's exactly the distinction I've been trying to find the words for. Thank you for finding them for me." We finished dinner and he hugged me goodbye the way he always does now, and told me, as he always does, that he still doesn't fully understand how he got lucky enough to keep a daughter-in-law after losing a son, and I told him, as I always do, that he didn't get lucky. I simply decided, 11 weeks into an audit I never wanted to run, that some parts of a family are worth saving even after you've had to burn the rest of it down to find them. I haven't told you yet about the specific week between the arrest and the initial indictment, the strange, suspended 7 days where the story hadn't yet become public in any formal sense but had already begun leaking, in fragments, through the social circles that had witnessed it firsthand. And I think that week deserves its own space here because it taught me something about how quickly a carefully controlled reveal can outpace your own ability to control the narrative once it's left your hands. By the Monday after the gala, 2 days later, I had already received 11 separate calls from numbers I didn't recognize. 3 of them reporters from local business publications who had clearly gotten wind of the story from guests who'd been at the cathedral room that night, and I made the deliberate decision, on Robert's advice, not to speak to any of them directly, not because I had anything to hide, but because I understood that the version of this story that mattered most, the documented, court-verified version, needed to be the version that eventually became public record, not a rushed, incomplete account assembled from secondhand gala gossip. The first published piece ran 9 days after the gala, in a regional business journal, a relatively careful, fact-checked account that focused primarily on the embezzlement allegations and the federal charges, with only a brief, restrained mention of the personal circumstances that had reportedly precipitated the investigation. I remember reading it at my kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me, and feeling a strange, almost clinical satisfaction at seeing my own case. The case I'd built alone, at 2 a.m., over 11 weeks, described in print with the same careful, documented precision I'd built it with in the first place. The reporter had clearly spoken with someone close to the federal investigation, though not, I later confirmed with Denise Okafor, anyone on her actual team, and the article was accurate in every material detail, which mattered enormously to me, because I think if that first published account of this story had gotten the facts wrong, sensationalized or distorted them the way tabloid coverage sometimes does with cases like this, some of the credibility I'd spent 11 weeks building would have been at risk of unraveling in the court of public opinion even while the actual federal case remained rock solid. A second, considerably less careful piece ran about 3 weeks later, in a smaller, more gossip-oriented outlet, and this one did lean harder into the personal drama. The affair, the public confrontation, details about my dress, my ice-cold composure, language that made me faintly uncomfortable even though I understood, rationally, that a woman calmly ending a marriage and an embezzlement scheme in front of 320 witnesses was always going to generate exactly this kind of narrative interest. I chose not to respond to that piece either, not to correct it, not to add commentary, because I'd already learned, by that point, that engaging with the sensational version only extends its life, while simply continuing to live my actual life, quietly, competently, rebuilding my firm and my home and my sense of self, did more to establish the true shape of the story than any statement I could have issued. I want to tell you, too, about a specific moment from about 6 weeks after the gala that I think illustrates something important about how thoroughly this experience reshaped my relationship with my own intuition. The quiet internal signal I'd spent 11 years quietly overriding every time it flickered uncomfortably during a family dinner or a conversation with Diane. I was reviewing a new client's books for Ashcroft Analytics, a mid-size regional restaurant group with 14 locations, and about 40 minutes into the initial review, I felt a small, specific discomfort settle in my chest. Nothing I could immediately point to on the page, just a faint, nagging sense that something in the vendor payment structure didn't sit right. 6 weeks earlier, before everything with Marcus, I might have finished that first pass, noted a few minor irregularities, and moved on to a deeper audit only if a client specifically requested one. Instead, I sat with that discomfort, followed it, and spent the following 4 hours tracing a pattern that turned out to be a genuine, if smaller scale, case of vendor kickback fraud involving one of the restaurant group's regional managers. Nowhere near the scale of the Whitfield case, but real. Costing the client an estimated $63,000 over roughly a year. Fraud I might, in my old professional habits, have taken considerably longer to catch, or might have missed the initial thread of entirely, if I hadn't relearned, the hardest possible way, exactly how much weight to give that small, specific, uncomfortable feeling of something not quite adding up. I've built that lesson into how I train every analyst who joins my firm now. The technical skill of forensic accounting matters enormously. The pattern recognition, the documentation discipline, all of it. But underneath the technical skill, I try to teach something harder to formalize into a training manual. The discipline of actually trusting your own discomfort long enough to follow it all the way to the bottom of the page, rather than smoothing it over the way I smoothed over 11 years of small, dismissed details about my own marriage before a hotel parking lot finally forced me to stop. There's one more piece of this story I want to share before I answer the question I asked you earlier, and it's about Marisol Ferrer, because our professional relationship, like the one with Denise Okafor, has continued well past the closing of the case itself. About 7 months after the gala, Marisol called me, not for a case, but to ask whether I'd be willing to speak, anonymously, to a support group she volunteers with for women in the early stages of exactly the kind of financial infidelity discovery I'd gone through. Women who'd just found the first thread of a hidden debt, a hidden account, a pattern of withdrawals that didn't add up, and didn't yet know how to pull that thread all the way to the truth. I agreed, and I've spoken to that group 4 times now, always anonymously, always focused less on the specifics of my own case and more on the practical mechanics, how to document without tipping your hand, how to separate your own accounts before confronting anyone, how to build a paper trail patient enough to survive scrutiny rather than one assembled in a single furious afternoon that a good defense attorney could pick apart in minutes. I remember at the first of those sessions, a woman about my age, maybe a year or 2 younger, asking me the question I still find hardest to answer honestly. How did you make yourself wait 11 weeks? I found out my husband had a second credit card 3 days ago, and I already want to burn the house down. I told her what I still believe is the truest answer I have, that the waiting wasn't about self-control in some abstract virtuous sense. It was about understanding, with total clarity, that the version of justice available to a furious woman acting in week 1 is almost always smaller, messier, and easier to talk your way out of than the version available to a patient woman acting in week 11, with a case built strong enough that no amount of charm, no amount of family loyalty, no amount of expensive legal maneuvering can talk it back down to a misunderstanding. I told her that the fury doesn't go away by waiting. It just gets channeled into something with teeth. I want to give you a little more of the granular detail from those first 2 critical weeks of the investigation, because I think the specific mechanics matter to anyone watching this who might someday need them, and because I don't think I gave the earliest days quite enough space earlier in this story. When I ordered that bump key for Marcus's desk drawer, I spent the 2 days waiting for it to arrive doing something I haven't mentioned yet. I quietly, methodically photographed every single document in our shared home filing cabinet. The mundane one. The one containing tax returns and insurance policies and mortgage documents, not because I expected to find anything incriminating there specifically, but because I understood, even that early, that I needed a complete baseline of our actual, legitimate shared finances before I could reliably identify what didn't belong. It took me 4 hours, working while Marcus was at a Saturday golf outing, laying every document flat on our dining room table and photographing it with my phone at a careful, consistent angle, then refiling everything in the exact order I'd found it, down to which folder tab faced which direction. That baseline turned out to matter enormously 3 weeks later, when I was cross-referencing the HELOC statements against our joint tax filings and noticed a discrepancy that wouldn't have been visible without the complete picture. A mortgage interest deduction claimed on our joint return that was roughly $4,000 higher than what our actual mortgage statement supported. A discrepancy that, once I traced it, led me to discover that Marcus had, at some point 18 months earlier, taken out a second, smaller loan against the house that he'd structured to look, on paper, like additional principal paid down rather than new debt taken on. A piece of the puzzle Gerald Fitch's office had apparently helped him structure without, I believe, fully understanding what they were structuring, since the request had come through as a routine refinancing consolidation, rather than anything flagged as unusual. I also want to describe, in more detail than I have so far, the actual physical process of building the 71-page report itself, because I think there's something worth understanding in the sheer, unglamorous labor of it. I worked almost exclusively between the hours of 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., after Marcus was reliably asleep, at the kitchen island, using a laptop that never once connected to our home's shared Wi-Fi network, instead tethered to a separate mobile hotspot registered under Ashcroft Analytics, specifically so that no browser history, no downloaded document, no search query would ever appear on any device or network Marcus might, even accidentally, have access to. I built the report in layers, the way I'd build any forensic case for a client. First, a raw transaction ledger, every single dollar I could trace, dated and sourced. Then, a narrative timeline overlaying that ledger with the specific events I could corroborate independently. The Sunday dinners, the golf outings, the closing dinners with investors that never corresponded to any actual closing on the calendar. And finally, once Robert and then Marisol and then eventually Agent Okafor's team were involved, a fully cross-referenced exhibit structure, each claim supported by at minimum 2 independent sources, because I understood, from years of watching defense attorneys pick apart weaker cases, that a single-sourced claim is a claim a good lawyer can simply argue away. I slept, on average, across those 11 weeks, somewhere between 4 and 5 hours a night. And I want to be honest that the physical toll of that sustained exhaustion is something I still notice the residue of, even now. A kind of low-grade fatigue that took nearly 6 months after the gala to fully resolve. A specific, bone-deep tiredness that no amount of sleep in any single night seemed able to immediately erase. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because I think people sometimes imagine a story like mine as a triumphant, almost effortless unmasking, a woman calmly assembling a case with the icy ease of a television drama, and the truth is considerably more exhausting than that, considerably more physically costly, built on 11 weeks of genuinely insufficient sleep, genuinely constant vigilance, genuinely difficult performances of ordinary domestic warmth toward a man I was simultaneously documenting for federal prosecutors. I want to say a little more too about the specific choice I made regarding the timing of the reveal. Why the gala, specifically, rather than a quieter confrontation once the federal case was ready? Robert asked me this directly, more than once, during our planning sessions, genuinely curious whether I'd considered simply letting Agent Okafor's team execute the arrests privately, at Marcus's office, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, sparing everyone the specific, dramatic publicity of the cathedral room. I told him, each time he asked, the same answer: that a private arrest would have let this family do what it had always done best for 41 years: manage the narrative, control the story, present a curated, softened version of events to their social circle before anyone outside the immediate family ever learned the full truth. I had watched Diane manage Marcus's reputation my entire marriage, watched Caroline manage Bianca's presence in their lives, watched this entire family construct careful, plausible versions of events that let genuine rot continue quietly underneath a polished surface for years. I understood that the only way to guarantee this particular rot could never simply be managed back into a softer, more palatable shape was to force its exposure into a room full of witnesses who would carry an unmanaged, unfiltered, simultaneous account of exactly what had happened, spreading through the family's own social and business circles, faster and more completely than any curated statement could ever contain. That was, I think, the single most calculated decision of the entire 11 weeks. Not the financial tracing, which was simply methodology, simply the technical skill I'd built my career on, but the decision about exactly where, and exactly how publicly, to let the truth finally surface. I built the case to survive federal scrutiny. I chose the venue to survive social scrutiny, to make absolutely certain that no version of "it was overblown" or "it's really more complicated than that" could ever fully take root, because 320 people had watched it happen, in real time, with their own eyes, standing in a room with crystal chandeliers, holding champagne glasses that suddenly felt very heavy in their hands. There's one final thread I want to close out before I leave you with the question that's been sitting underneath this entire story, and it involves Preston Hayes, Caroline's husband, because his response to everything, in the months after the gala, ended up surprising me more than almost anyone else's. Preston had always struck me, across 11 years of family dinners, as the quietest, most peripheral figure in the Whitfield orbit, a competent, unremarkable hedge fund analyst who mostly nodded along at Diane's comments and Caroline's stories without ever quite asserting an independent presence of his own. But in the 6 months following the scandal, Preston did something none of us expected. He hired his own independent forensic auditor, at his own expense, to review every joint account he shared with Caroline, not out of suspicion of his wife specifically, but, as he told Robert Voss directly, because I watched an entire family's finances turn out to be built on quicksand, and I'm not interested in finding out 10 years from now that I built my own family's foundation on the same ground without ever once checking it myself. That audit, as it happened, turned up nothing alarming in Preston and Caroline's own finances. No hidden debts, no secret accounts, nothing beyond the ordinary financial texture of a stable, if now noticeably cooler, marriage. But I've heard, through Robert, that Preston still commissions that same kind of independent review every single year now. A quiet, permanent ritual of verification that Caroline apparently finds faintly insulting and Preston considers simply, unapologetically, non-negotiable. I think about that detail sometimes as one of the stranger, more unexpected ripple effects of everything that happened. A marriage that survived, technically, but was permanently reshaped by the discovery that the family surrounding it had been capable of exactly this kind of sustained, elaborate deception, close enough to touch, close enough that no one, not even a quiet, peripheral hedge fund analyst, could afford to simply assume anymore that appearances told the whole story. I also think, often, about the 612 employees of Whitfield Development Group who had absolutely nothing to do with any of this, who showed up to work every single day throughout the entire scandal, the trial, the sentencing, doing their jobs, building the Meridian Business Park, managing the Ashgrove Commons Retail Center, running the day-to-day operations of a company whose name had, for a few painful months, become synonymous in local business press with fraud and betrayal, rather than the 41 years of legitimate, careful work that had actually built it. I met with a cross-section of them, about 5 months after the gala, as part of the governance restructuring process, held a series of small listening sessions in conference rooms across the company's 3 main offices, and I remember, distinctly, a construction site foreman named Danny Alcaraz, 26 years with the company, telling me, with a directness I found genuinely moving, I don't care about the family drama, ma'am. I care that for 2 decades I watched this company do right by its people, pay on time, build things that actually stand up. I just need to know that's still true going forward, whatever happened at the top. I told him it was still true, and more importantly, I told him exactly why it would keep being true. The new audit structure, the whistleblower protections, the segregation of duties, because I understood, in that room, that the people who deserved the clearest, most concrete answers about what came next weren't the guests at the gala. They were the 612 people whose actual livelihoods depended on this company surviving its own worst instincts. I think, finally, about what I'd say to the version of myself sitting in that parking lot outside the Wickham Grand, 11 weeks and what feels now like an entire lifetime ago, if I could somehow send a message backward through time to that exact moment. 9 no. 12 p.m., engine off, hands just barely shaking on the steering wheel, watching a light go dark in a fourth-floor window. I think I'd tell her this. You already know what you need to do. You've known it, on some quiet, unacknowledged level, for longer than you're willing to admit yet. Don't rush it, and don't soften it, and don't, for even a single day of the 11 weeks ahead of you, let anyone's comfort, not Marcus's, not Diane's, not even your own occasional exhaustion at 2 a.m., talk you into closing the case before it's actually, completely, undeniably closed. You are not being cruel, you are being exact. And exactness, in the end, is the only kind of love this particular family ever actually understood. I think, too, about the specific weight of the word underestimated, because it's a word people have used about me, in articles and in private conversations both, more times than I can count since that night in the cathedral room, and I want to be precise about what it actually meant in practice, because I think precision matters more than the word itself. Being underestimated by the Whitfields never felt, in the moment, like an insult sharp enough to notice consciously. It felt like small, cumulative erosion, a joke about my little consulting business here, an assumption there that I'd defer to Diane's seating chart without question, a quiet, unstated expectation that the accountant who married into the family existed primarily to keep things tidy rather than to ever actually be the one who decided, unilaterally, exactly how and when the tidiest possible version of a hidden truth would come apart. I don't think any of them, not even Marcus, ever once imagined that the quiet, agreeable woman pouring coffee at 6:15 every morning was capable of building, alone, in the dark, a case precise enough to end all of their carefully managed lives in a single evening. That miscalculation, more than any single piece of financial evidence, is the thing I think about most now, because it taught me something I try to carry forward into every part of my life since. Being underestimated isn't a wound. Handled correctly, with enough patience and enough discipline, it's simply leverage, sitting there, waiting for the moment you finally decide to use it. I want to leave you with one more image before I close this out, because it's the one that comes back to me most often, more than the stage at the cathedral room, more than the courtroom, more than any of it. It's a smaller moment, from about 2 months after the divorce was finalized, a Tuesday evening, nothing dramatic about it at all. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my new house, alone, going through Priya's first independent case file, red pen in hand, marking small corrections the way any mentor would, and I looked up at some point and realized I'd been humming, quietly, without noticing, the same song that had been playing in the cathedral room the night everything came apart. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over, waiting for the flinch I expected, the old reflex of pain I'd trained myself to fold away and keep working through. It didn't come. What came instead was something closer to simple, unremarkable peace. The specific, quiet satisfaction of a woman sitting in a house entirely her own, doing work entirely her own, humming a song that no longer belonged to anyone else's story but hers. I think that's the actual ending of this particular chapter, more than the sentencing hearing or the restitution schedule, or even the reflective, rhetorical question I've been building toward this entire time. Not vindication. Not triumph, exactly. Just an ordinary Tuesday evening, red pen in hand, a song playing that used to mean something painful and now, simply, doesn't anymore. That's what 11 weeks of discipline actually buys you, in the end. Not a dramatic victory lap, but the much quieter, much harder-won ability to sit in your own kitchen, on an ordinary night, and simply, finally, feel nothing but at ease. I keep that legal pad still, the original one, 7 weeks of handwritten numbers and dates and names, tucked in the bottom drawer of my new desk. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of exactly how much patient, unglamorous work it actually takes to turn a single gut punch of a discovery into something undeniable. Every so often, usually late at night, I take it out and flip through the early pages, the shaky handwriting from that first week, and I think about how far a person can travel in 11 weeks, once she finally decides to stop smiling through the discomfort and start writing everything down instead. Some nights the handwriting steadies within a page or two. Some nights it takes longer, but it always eventually steadies. And that's the part I try to remember most. The part I'd want anyone sitting at their own kitchen table tonight, staring at their own version of a number that doesn't add up, to hold on to as well. That number always has a story underneath it, and the story always, eventually, wants to be found. So let me ask you the question I've been sitting with since that night, the one I still don't have a clean answer for, even now. How long would you have stayed quiet if you'd found what I found in that hotel parking lot? And how much do you think it would have taken? How much money? How many lies? Before your own kindness finally ran out? There are details from those 11 weeks I haven't told you yet. Details that matter, I think, because they show you how ordinary the surface of my life looked while all of this was happening underneath it. And I think that ordinariness is the part people find hardest to believe when I tell this story now. I still went to my Pilates class every Tuesday and Thursday morning, the same class I'd attended for 4 years, and I still made small talk with the same 6 women I saw there every week. Women who had no idea that the woman stretching on the mat beside them was, at that exact moment, 3 weeks into tracing a shell company through Delaware business filings on her lunch break. I still picked up my dry cleaning every other Friday from the same cleaner on Larchmont Avenue, still made Marcus's coffee every morning at 6:15, 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, and I want to tell you honestly that there were mornings, especially early on, in week 2 and 3, when making that coffee felt like the hardest. Strangest thing I had ever done, my hands moving through a routine of care for a man I was simultaneously building a federal case against, my face arranging itself into the same soft, familiar warmth it had worn every morning for 11 years, while some entirely separate part of my mind was already running through the wire transfer dates I needed to cross-reference that evening. I remember one morning in particular, week 4, standing at the kitchen counter pouring that coffee, watching Marcus scroll through his phone with the same distracted, half-present energy he'd had for months, and feeling something close to vertigo. Not from guilt, because I never felt guilty, not once, but from the sheer strangeness of loving someone, or having loved someone, or having believed for 11 years that I loved someone, while simultaneously understanding, with total clarity, that the version of him I'd built that love around had never actually existed. The man drinking coffee at my counter that morning was not the man I married. He never had been. I had simply never had the data to see the difference until now. Marisol Ferrer became, over those 11 weeks, something closer to a wartime ally than a hired investigator, and I want to tell you about one specific night with her that I've never fully described to anyone, because it's the night I came closest to breaking the cold discipline I'd built around myself. It was week 6, close to midnight, and Marisol had called me to her office to show me the surveillance photos from that day. Marcus and Bianca at a restaurant 20 minutes outside the city. The same kind of private, out-of-the-way booth Caroline and Bianca had used for their own meetings. In the photos, Marcus was laughing, genuinely, unguardedly, in a way I hadn't seen him laugh with me in longer than I wanted to admit, reaching across the table to tuck a strand of hair behind Bianca's ear, with a tenderness that looked, infuriatingly, completely real. I sat in Marisol's office staring at that photograph for a long time, and Marisol, who had seen exactly this reaction from exactly this kind of client more times than she could count, didn't say anything for a while, just let me look, and then finally said, quietly, "The tenderness is real, Elena." That's usually the hardest part for people to accept. It doesn't make what he's doing to you less of a betrayal. It just means he's capable of real feeling, and he chose, repeatedly, deliberately, to spend it somewhere else while lying to your face every single day. I remember nodding, and I remember feeling something crack, just slightly, somewhere behind my sternum. A small, sharp pain that lasted maybe 90 seconds before I closed it back down, folded the photograph closed, and asked Marisol what our next step was. That was the closest I came, in 11 weeks, to letting any of it show. 90 seconds, in a private investigator's office, at midnight, with no one watching but a woman who understood, professionally and personally, exactly why I needed to fold that pain away and keep working. I also want to tell you about a scene I skipped over earlier, because it happened quietly, almost incidentally, but it ended up mattering more than I expected at the time. Week 7, 2 days before I first called Robert Voss, I ran into Gerald Fitch, the tired, compliant company accountant who had signed off on Marcus's inflated expenses for years without asking hard questions, at a coffee shop near the Whitfield Tower. Gerald was 61 years old, 3 years from retirement, and I had always found him a faintly sad figure, a man who had clearly, at some point early in his career, made an unspoken bargain to stop asking questions in exchange for stability, and had been quietly living inside that bargain for over 2 decades. I sat down across from him, uninvited, and asked him, directly, whether he'd ever noticed anything unusual about the change orders on the Meridian Business Park project. I watched Gerald's face do something complicated. Not quite fear, not quite guilt. Something closer to relief. The specific relief of a man who has been waiting, for a very long time, for someone else to finally ask the question he'd never had the courage to ask himself. "I noticed," he said quietly, stirring a coffee he wasn't drinking. 18 months ago, maybe longer, I told myself it was probably just aggressive but legitimate cost padding, the kind every contractor does a little of. I didn't look closer because looking closer meant I'd have to decide what to do about what I found, and I've got 2 years left before my pension vests, Elena. I'm not proud of that. But I didn't look. I didn't tell Gerald, that day, what I already knew. I simply thanked him, paid for his coffee, and left. But that conversation ended up mattering 4 months later, because when Agent Okafor's team eventually interviewed Gerald as part of the broader investigation, his voluntary, unprompted admission that he'd noticed irregularities and failed to escalate them became, oddly, one of the pieces of evidence that helped establish the scheme's timeline most precisely. Not because Gerald was complicit, the investigation ultimately cleared him of any criminal wrongdoing, citing his cooperation and the absence of any direct financial benefit to himself, but because his memory of exactly when the pattern of aggressive padding began helped Agent Okafor's forensic accountants pin down, almost to the month, when Trevor Locke's scheme first widened beyond its original, smaller scale into the version that eventually pulled Marcus in as a full partner. Gerald kept his job, in the end, and his pension. Harold, in the restructuring that followed the scandal, brought him under my new oversight role rather than removing him, on the theory, one I actually agreed with, that a compliant accountant who had finally, belatedly, learned the cost of not asking questions was, going forward, likely to be considerably more vigilant than a replacement, with no memory of exactly how badly things had once gone wrong. Gerald and I meet quarterly now, and I have to tell you, he asks harder questions in those meetings than almost anyone else on my new compliance team. I've already told this story from the parking lot to the courtroom to the quiet third Sunday dinners that came after, and there's a fourth family, one I haven't even mentioned yet, currently sitting 3 exhaustive layers deep in a compliance case my firm just opened last week. A family business, a trusted brother-in-law, a set of invoices that don't quite add up the way they should, and if you've stayed with me this entire time, you already know exactly why I'm not going to let this next one slide either. If you've read this far, you've already shown me you're the kind of person who follows a case all the way to the end, and that's exactly the kind of person who should be here for the next one. Subscribe now because that story is coming, and I promise you it starts even quieter than this one did.